Dim memories of how things I used to know. Hope you're all doing well. Let's see. It's been a while. I guess it's been just about a month since we all got together. Apologies for having little content on the channel between Christmas and family stuff and the bathroom. It's been hard to make videos. I've been getting stuff done. You can see something on the bench there, but it's it'll get back to normal very soon. This is not a relict guitar. Neither is it vintage in the sense that most people think of it. This is my friend Steve's 1983 Fullerton Strat, much gigged since then. And this is the one which led to the revitalization of Fender after the dark years of the 70s and turned into the American Vintage Reissue series. And this thing has just been played to hell. It had 6,100 frets, which are all flattened out now. It's got a hump up here, which is very common to Strats. It really needs some work beyond what I can do, but I was able to get the truss rod a little bit straighter because it had a big old bow to it, and I had to shim the neck a little bit to offset this hump. And it's playing well, but it's got a lot of plinky to it. But I'm really happy with how it's come out. I've got to put a Strat button on there. You can see it's had the original Strat button and then replacement, and that replacement snapped off the screws in the wood and the original holes all opened up. So I'm going to drill that out and plug it and give them a Strat button so you can bring this back into use. It's got a crazy thin neck. It's like Ibanez thin. It's really hard to get used to, and you can see that they didn't quite get the headstock shape right in '83, but on the heels of the Strat Ultra and all that stuff that they were doing before, which can be cool guitars, but very different from the old deal. And I'm really happy with this. Now, and don't use wood filler to hold a Strat button in. You'll be sad at exactly the wrong time. It will not hold. Anyway, let me turn off the gate so that it's not going to do anything weird to my voice as we speak. And that was through that 65 Princeton with the G10C. So now wood filler and all that stuff. Plug it with a hardwood dowel, glue that in real well, and then re-drill. That's the way to do it. And that's pretty easy to do. So let's get to all the questions. I got a super chat. They're James Music Products. I'll get to you in just a minute. I try to answer them in the order that their questions are asked. So let's see here if I remember how to do all this stuff. James Rowland 65. Hey, James. For a deluxe reverb reissue, is changing the slope resistor from 100K to 56K and the treble cap from 249 picofarad, it's actually 250 nominally, to 500 picofarad worth it for more mid-range, less high-end, or does it just sacrifice those Fender cleans? Well, you already got a 6.8K mids resistor on the deluxe reverb. If you want more mids without losing the scooped sound that makes the amp famous, I would suggest adding a 100K audio taper mids pot, especially on a reissue. I do it all the time. You can see on the channel, add it to the rear panel. There's plenty of room there to drill a 3/8 inch hole and install a 100K audio taper pot. The mids pot in an old Fender is a 10K audio, which means that when it's at noon, it's at 10% of its value. So that 10K at noon is about 1K. So you get a Fender Twin, you set it to noon, which is a lot of people do. You're looking at 1 to 1.5K in that range, depending on the pot taper. to get to the value of a deluxe reverb, you would have to turn that up to about 3, 4 o'clock. So that's a lot of mids already in the deluxe circuit. So if you use a 100K audio taper pot, that means at noon it's at 10K. So at noon it's at the max mid-range that an old Fender gives you. And about 10 o'clock, it's where a deluxe reverb naturally is with the 6.8K. You turn it down to like 830, you're about twin mids, typical twin reverb mid-range setting. And then above noon, you get into a lot more mids and boosts. I guess from your perspective, be like this. And that'd be the easiest way to give you more mids without sacrificing. I don't think that the 500 picofarad and 56K would be that useful. There are a lot of other things you need to do to push it towards the basement thing. You got to change out the cap values. You got to change out the pot values. So just try a mids pot. That way you can have more mids, have more gain, but you can also get right back to where you started from, and there's nothing wrong with a deluxe reverb in stock form. Hey, everybody. I'm not going to say hello to everyone individually, but I appreciate you all being here and saying hello. Joshua Stevens, what are my thoughts on using shielded wire on a Larmar post-phase inverter master volume? Also, does the star ground at the input need to be used to avoid a ground loop? No. First of all, shielding is separate from grounding. So if you use shielded and you want to shield it to ground, you can just shield it to any adjacent ground, just using the shield, the ground there as a shield. So it'll only be connected to one side, be what's called a telescope ground. So there'll be no path. You don't have to do that in a typical amp, which has two bias leak, grid leak resistors for the output tubes, typically 220K from a lot of amps. Those are going from the negative bias to the output caps of the phase inverter. And those are the two resistors that you're replacing with a dual gang master volume pot anyway. So they need to go at pin 1 and pin 4, respectively, of that pot to that bias point. And that bias point, being a negative voltage, will give you shielding. So typically, I will just use twisted wires. So I'll have I'll use red and yellow for right and left output, and then I'll use a blue to the bias, and I'll twist them all together. And because they're tightly twisted, and it's not a very sensitive part of the circuit, that works just fine. But if you want to, you can use a 2-conductor shielded cable and connect the shield at both ends, in this case, to that bias point. The bias, typical eyelet on an old Fender. Same point exists in most push-pull amps with a fixed bias. Also works in a cathode biased amp, though, in which case you can just use ground. I hope that's clear. Let me know if it's not. Hey, the Valve Amp Hobby Shop. Why were there early, and this was the first question I think that was asked, but it appeared on this screen third, sorry. Why were the early Ampeg tube bass amps much more complex than the offerings from Fender around the same time? Were their engineers looking at different sources for circuit ideas? Thanks. Well, there are two big swingers in the Ampeg bass amp range, the B15 and B12, and the SVT. And both of them were trying to get the most output without distortion. And you can look at their stuff. It's coming from a hi-fi background rather than Fender's more, he figured out what worked for guitar, which also worked for bass. And that's very much not trying to have fidelity in the same way that a hi-fi design does. They have very high voltages on the screens. They're using different tube types. In the case of the SVT, they have cathode followers after the phase inverter. It's a very complicated circuit. Even the B15 is essentially a complicated circuit. And the goal is to have a lot of swing to the output tubes and as much output level from those tubes as possible without any clipping. So it's just a very different approach, kind of coming from a hi-fi background. Much more complicated, and they were much more expensive even at the time. James Music Products, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. Could I comment on the pros and cons of phased heater wiring in terms of noise, hum reduction? Merry New Year. Well, Merry New Year to you and to all. Sometimes, and it's rare, it can make a difference. I've only had it make a difference about twice, I think. And on an awful lot of Fender amps, I have said, okay, let's go through here and see where everything's going. Oh, they reversed this. Let's find out if it's any quieter if I put it how it's supposed to be correct. So 4 and 5 of all the preamp tubes are connected, and 9 of all the preamp tubes are connected, and 9 of all the preamp tubes goes to 7 of the power tubes, and 4 and 5 of all the preamp tubes goes to 2 of the, usually it makes no difference. And so I have stopped doing it unless, and in very few times, I have found examples where the amp had some heater noise or a sensitivity to heater noise, and changing that was the final trick. So I don't think it needs to be done every time. If you have an amp that comes in where that's incorrect, but the amp sounds good, then it's fine. I think it's probably going to fall under the category of best practice, where if you're building an amp, go ahead and do it because it absolutely cannot hurt, and it might help. But I think people ascribe it magical qualities, which don't make an awful lot of sense. There's some, I've read articles saying that Fender did it deliberately, reversing tubes to get like a humbucker out of phase effect. But that doesn't make any sense if you actually look at the circuit, because what's reversed in some Fenders is just random, and the two triodes of one tube are already out of phase with each other. But the heater can't do that. So I think there are an awful lot back in the day of magazines, and today magazines that needed to fill column inches, so they'd write about stuff. And today, I think people want to have something to type in a forum. And so every little thing gets magnified and discussed, because what else are you going to talk about? You want to shut off all that stuff and go get a metronome and sit down and practice? No one wants to do that. We need to buy our way to a better life, or type about it. Hey, Nick Pentanzi, appreciate that. Let's see. Hey, Josh Bittner, new amp day, Mesa Mark III. Caps look good, but which caps should be upgraded over stock from the factory to better higher capacity caps? Well, the Mark III is usually going to have fine filter caps. In terms of the big 450 volt, 500 volt caps. If they're 30 years old, change them out. But if you open them up and they're typically Sprague Adams, if they're still working fine, they're absolutely fine. The caps that need to be upgraded in the Mark III or almost any Mesa are the following. Any tantalum capacitors used typically in the cathodes, they use 15 volt caps, and when they fail, which they do from time to time, because of over voltage, they burn and they stink, and they're kind of pointless. So tantalum should be changed pretty much on site in a Mesa if it's in the budget. For electrolytics, yes, they'll need to be changed every 20, 30 years, but they won't blow up. And you can get a 63 volt cap in there instead of a 15 volt cap. The other cap which needs to be changed is any film cap in a Mesa, which is rated for 400 volts, which routinely has more than 400 volts across it. For instance, the phase inverter output of Mesas, they may have 350 volts on the plate when no current is being drawn by that tube, and it's a 400 volt cap, and the bias voltage is negative 53 volts, and so it's not 400 volts from zero, it's 400 volts from positive to negative. So you have 350 volts above zero, and then you have 53 volts below negative on the bias. That cap has got 403 volts across it. So pretty much in any Mesa, the 400 volt caps are nonsense. I change them out routinely to 630 volt caps. It's not just best practice. I see them fail and hear them fail all the time in Mesa designs. I don't know why a Mesa doubled down on 400 volt caps. I have no idea why almost every capacitor in there is a 47 nanofarad. And they're freaking huge, and they're all glued together. So pretty much I use the Panasonic ECQ series 630 volt caps. They're physically smaller. They sound great. You're not going to hear any difference between that and a 715p. You know, it's easier to work with. It's not going to fail, and they're less expensive and lighter weight, so you don't have to have all the gobs of silicone everywhere. Hey, Mr. Brad, thanks for joining us. I'm glad you love the sound of it. I hope it stays that way for a long time. You know, it's not that I hate Mesas and I want them all to die. There's a Simulclass 88 Strategy 88 on the bench behind me. It blew up because of all these things, and I'm trying to bring it back to life for a friend. Its mute circuit has gone south, so it had no output, but pending the next shipment from Mauser arriving, it will be back up in action. So if you have a Mesa and it sounds good and it's working, I think that's fantastic. I hope nothing but the best for you. I hope it never darkens my bench or anyone else, any other tech's bench. I hope it just lasts and lasts and lasts. I'm just saying that statistically that's unlikely. And the decisions Mesa makes make it very likely that they will fail repetitively in the same dramatic, damaging ways that the owner then has to pay for. They have no business putting the word engineering in their advertisement copy. Do I have thoughts on a V-type in the Deluxe Reverb? Nick Orr says, yeah, I've tried the V-type in a Deluxe Reverb. I'm not a huge fan, but it's not bad. I primarily tried the V-type most recently that I can remember. I know I've heard it with the Deluxe Reverb, so I think I most recently heard the V-type with a Sir Ombre, and it would not be my first choice, but it is a good choice. And I had a Deluxe Reverb here at the same time, and I ran it into that V-type just to see what a different amp sounded like in that cabinet with that speaker, and it sounded good. A bit mid-rangey, a bit mid-range prominent, but it's a good sound. It reminded me kind of the Eminence Texas Heat, which is another popular choice for I think for certain styles. If you're playing a Telly and you want to get kind of a Brad Paisley thing, I think that might be a real good choice. Let's see. Hey, Peter Mancuso, thank you. I just received an early EVH3 6L 600 watt head. Anything I should keep in mind in terms of upkeep? It was toured across Canada for a few years. Wow. Honestly, if I wasn't in a video and we were sitting having a cup of coffee together, I'd say that amp's going to fail, and when it fails, it's going to be expensive. And there are other amps in a similar price range which do similar sounds. I want to sell it while it's working. I know that's not something I should say really in public, because you're supposed to be positive about things, and I like to be positive about things, but they're just so badly built. They're just cramming so much into a price point and lots of features I think that the perceived quality, or the amount of quality that they want you to perceive, is not correlated to the actual quality inside that amp. But if you're happy with it, make sure all the hardware is tight, and don't spill anything on it, and don't drop it, and keep your fingers crossed. There's not much you can do to improve them. Hey, Steve Smith, thank you very much. He's got a Deluxe Reverb reissue that's been developed, a fizzing sound, very noticeable when not playing. Ideas. The first thing I would do with any reissue, especially one that has that symptom, is I've got a video on things that owners can do for their reissue Fenders themselves, and this is part of it, and it shows how to drain the caps. Once the caps are drained, so there's no voltage inside waiting to zap you, take it out of the chassis and make sure all the hardware is tight, because it's very rare for all the hardware to be tight. Input jacks, speaker jacks, pots, all these things, and those affect the grounding in a Deluxe Reverb. And if they're not tight, I mean, the difference between a quiet amp and a noisy amp can be a quarter turn of a socket. So that's the first thing to do. Make sure that you have good connections, and then roll tubes. If you pull on a Deluxe Reverb, for instance, pull every preamp tube except for V1 and V6. So looking at it from the back, the one on the far right, and the phase inverter, which is the last one next to the power tubes. All the others can come out. Do you still have fizzing? If you don't, and that you'll still be able to play the normal channel at this point. If you don't have fizzing, you may have a bad tube. So then you can say, all right, well, let me put in V5, which is the tremolo tube. Okay, no fizzing there. Let me put in V3, which is the reverb driver tube. Any fizzing? No. Well, it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means it's not drawing down the power supply. Then put in V2 and V4, so you have the reverb channel back, and then see if the buzzing is, hey, Jeff, thanks for joining me, man. See if the buzzing is just in the reverb recovery. Sometimes that's the case. But those are the things I would do if it were on my bench before I did anything else. Just make sure the hardware's tight and it's not just a bad tube. Also make sure that you don't have a bad instrument cable. So if you unplug from the amp, if the fizzing goes away, that fizzing is coming from an outside source. So let's see. Lots of Happy New Year's, people talking to each other, which is great. Thanks, Matt Johnson. What does ultralinear mean in the later Fender amps? Hey, Martin, Happy New Year to you there. Ultralinear means that, much like the earlier stuff I was talking about with the Ampeg SVT, the design is to have as much wattage out of a tube as possible, as much output, and as clean as possible. So instead of getting into distortion, it stays linear, or as linear as possible. Now, distortion does not mean that, hey, with an old, say, 65 twin reverb, or super reverb, it's going to sound like Megadeth. And then with a 78, which has the ultralinear, it's just going to sound like, George Benson. It's not, distortion is not the same thing in an amplifier as what we assume it is with a distortion pedal or, styles of music which use a lot of distortion. It just means whether there are a lot of added harmonics, whether certain things that our ear still perceives as clean or not actually clean on a scope. And so you look at, that's the era of the 135 watt twins instead of an 85 watt twin. So an 85 watt twin has the same set of 6L6s, 4 6L6s as the 135 watt ultralinear twin, which had a much bigger power and output transformer to compensate for that. Beyond that, it's outside the scope of a chat like this. And there's a lot of people out there saying the ultralinears suck and they need to make it sound like 65. I think the ultralinear stuff really sounds great for certain styles of music. If you're like a Jerry Garcia fan and you had an ultralinear twin reverb in good condition, my God, you are set. That is the sound. If you were playing in a Skinnerd band, that is one of those sounds, for a lot of things, if you've ever enjoyed playing, say, like a JC120, that's JC120 gets that sound, but it has a really narrow range on the volume before it gets distorted. A JC120 has two-thirds of the volume on the amp are unusable, but you can get that sound louder and better than a JC120 through an ultralinear twin or super reverb. And chorus pedals exist these days. So if you were trying to do like an 80s tribute thing, I would choose an ultralinear twin over a JC120 any day because I can add all kinds of modulation effects through pedals, but I would have a much better sounding core amp that's even cleaner than a JC120. The issue with the late 70s ultralinear stuff is that was the era of tons of spaghetti wiring, excess wiring, and the front panel would always flap off because the way it was only attached behind like 3 of the 4 nuts, and then the ring for the pilot lamp wasn't attached right, and had a separate baffle. The Velcroed on, that baffle would warp, and so there are quality issues to the amplifier build in the late 70s, and tons of wax. But the core circuit sounds great, and Brad or I or any good amp tech can get rid of the wax and the DC and clean up all the spaghetti wiring. And if it's got a push-pull master volume, just don't pull it. Never pull it. Just use it as master volume and snip the bright cap. There are a few other things about the Silverface amps that aren't great, but they're like one capacitor that was wrong, and I've discussed that a lot. Hey, ABC Electronics, I'll check out your video after this. Um, uh, I'm so swamped right now that I will not be able to take an AC30CC2 in for quite some time. But shoot me an email, info@sonicaudio.com, and I'll tell you what to do. It's not a lot. If you know how to work on electronics, and I hope with your name, you do know how. I'll just tell you, hey, change these parts to these parts, and it'll be good. Let's see. Is that the Rivera mod? I assume you typed that when I was talking about the mid spot. There are a lot of Rivera mods. Maybe you saw Tim Pierce's video the past couple of days about that. Paul did a lot of tweaks, things like mid-range stuff, and some of his mid-range stuff was changing caps, and some of it was changing slope resistors, and some of it was just changing the value of the resistance for mids, and then doing stuff with, hey, all right, instead of using the reverb for reverb, we'll use those tubes for additional gain stages. And he had, bright caps and gain boosts and mid-range shifts and all these things. And some of them sound really good. Some of them are not to my taste. All the stuff that Paul did was done well. And, nothing makes an amp unsafe. Not all of his choices are things that I've traditionally enjoyed, having worked on several modded Riveras, and a lot of Fenders from the Rivera era, and a lot of Rivera amps. But if they work for you, they do work really well. I think this is not a criticism. It's shop talk. I think the weakness of the Rivera amps that I've played is that they have so many options that the owner ends up getting option paralysis, and you can't say what that amp actually sounds like because it's trying to do all these different things. And I find if you find an amp that does one thing exceptionally well, that's more important than an amp that does a lot of things pretty damn well. And that was a hard thing for me to learn when I first started doing this, because I wanted to do, and you push this button and you pull the switch and you turn this and you hold your mouth just right, and then all of a sudden, simplify, simplify, simplify. And, that works for me and works for a lot of people. It's not the only way to approach life. Doop-a-doop-a-doo. Let's see, a lot of magic in the guitar world. So we're to that point. What is the bracket inside a 59 reissue cabinet bass here? Yeah, it's just there to be a shelf that the power transformer rests on. Now, some of the 59 Bassman reissues have that shelf. Some of them actually do have the little L bracket that you screw into the top that's attached to the power transformer, and some have both. And all variations on that are a major pain in the butt to work with. It's the one downside to the 59 reissue Bassman, but typically you only have to take it out once every 20 years for anything major. The rest of the time you just take the back off, change the tube, everything's or do work. That's easy. Hey, John Cordy, thanks for joining us. John, since you're here right now, the reason I have my buddy's 83 Fullerton Strat here, this will be revealed in a full video very soon. It's because I'm going to be doing a review of a guitar that's very familiar to you, John. The K-Line Springfield. K-Line sent this to me for review. And so I'm getting some Strats together so I can do an apples to apples comparison. Not, just say, this is great. Great compared to what? So I've got my Eric Johnson Strat, which has the Kinmans. I've got my buddy's 83 Fullerton, which has Fralins. And I'm going to get another Strat in here, which has Lawlers. And this one has the new, Charcoal Frost. This is the new K-Line Springfield, but they're making their own pickups now. And this is the 64 set. So I was going to do this at the next break, but I'll do it now since John's here. And John plays these guitars, and he sounds better than I do. But I'll see what I can do here with my rusty hands that are all swollen and pained from doing work in the bathroom. Now, I'll tell you real fast, which may not be apparent to you guys, because, you know, it was at the beginning of the video where I played the 83 with the Fralins. These pickups are much lower output than the Fralins. That's not a bad thing. That's just a difference. And these sound like, this sounds a lot like 64. I mean, I think he's really close. I've played a lot of 64 Fenders and 63 and 65. This is a really nice guitar, roasted pine body, new 64 pickups. I love the bridge. I'll be doing a very balanced review on this, but it's okay for me to say that my balanced review is going to be very positive because it's a really nice guitar. And Jeff Mizet there says, Sir and Anderson make the best. I like Sir. I like Anderson. And John Sir is a friend of mine. And they make really good too. There's no best. There is no best. There's only best for you. And, you know, it's nice to try different things of these three guitars. I like the Eric Johnson the best, but because that's mine, I've played it for 19 years now. And so that feels like home. The K-line has got, this one's a thinner neck than most of theirs. It's 0.83 at the first fret, so it feels a little bit small to me. I love the weight of it. I love the sound of it. I love the playability of it. The 83 Fullerton, it's got a tiny, tiny neck. I can barely play it, but I can play it. And it's beat to hell. And like I mentioned, its frets need to be redone. It's hard to play. It sounds really good, and those Fralins sound good. So I've got Fralins, I've got Kimmons, and I've got the 64s from K-line here. I've been playing them through the 65 Princeton and a 69 Princeton primarily. And they are all variations on really damn good. And if I can snap my fingers and have John here and sit in the seat, you get to really hear that. Now, when I do the review on this, you guys are going to hear some of my local pro buddies play through this stuff. So you'll get a chance to hear really good strats with Kinmans, Lawlers, Fralins, some Fenders, and the K-lines. A lot of rosebud neck strats, at least one maple neck strat. Great players all through really good amps that I've restored, because I'm much better at the amp side of things than the playing side of things. I've had to have heating pads on my arms the last couple of nights from some strains I've given myself in the bathroom remodel. I know it sounds like apologetic, but there's this perception on YouTube that anyone who has a guitar channel must be a badass motherfucker on guitar. And, you know, 20 years ago, I was much better. I've had injuries. My hands don't work as well as they used to. I'm 53. So, you know, everyone grow the fuck up. John is a much better guitarist than I am. That doesn't invalidate my experience of guitars. And I think he would agree with that. Anyway, let's get to the next one. What does it mean? Valve Amp Hobby Shop asks, what does it mean when people describe a phase inverter circuit as swinging more current versus swinging more voltage? Thanks. The real answer to this would be like a white paper that'd be 14 pages long. In general, there are two types of preamp tubes that we use. In general, we use voltage amplifiers like a 12AX7, and we use current amplifiers like a 12AT7 or 12AU7. So one of them is designed to have this much voltage at the input and this much voltage at the output. The others are designed to have this much current at the input and this much current at the output. Now, this is really rough stuff. It's gross generalizations. Sometimes you want to have the voltage amplifier because it gives a lot more gain and can impact the sound. Sometimes you just want to say, I need stronger current to be able to drive this 6L6, or a little less current to drive the 6V6, depending on the capability of the tube. You just want to have an efficient transfer of the sound entering the phase inverter and going to the power tubes. And so it doesn't take a lot of voltage to drive a transformer. It takes a lot of current. So a reverb transformer, typically we use a 12AT7, which is a current amplifier, because we need to give a lot of current to push to the tank, but it doesn't take a ton of voltage. And it's at about 300 volts DC, but that has the plate voltage is not the thing, it's the current. And man, this is where I'd like to have whiteboards and charts, and I'd have to have formulas ready for you. I imagine that you need to research this in a book, because even if I had all the charts and stuff, it'd be 30 minutes to really get it clear, I think. I always feel bad in this situation because it's like, if you can't explain something, do you really know it? And it's one of those things that I have not been teaching myself to be a teacher. I've not been teaching myself to be an instructor. I will spend time learning a particular subject and researching a particular subject and reading everything I can on a particular subject. And I come away from it with the things that I need to know that apply to me. And I don't focus on the minutiae at that point. It's like, if I need to calculate what the -3 dB frequency of a cathode a cathode stage is with a resistor and a value of capacitor with a certain voltage coming in, and RA and the move of the tube and all that stuff. I learned how to do all that, and now I have a calculator that I made using all that information, so I don't have to think about it. I just have to say, all right, I've got 289 volts at the node. I'm using a 101K resistor, let's say nominal 68K for this tube with a move factor of 100, and then I've got an 820 ohm cathode resistor. And if I change these different standard values of capacitor there, I know that I'm going to have a high pass of X, Y, or Z. So it's stuff that I know in terms of why it's important, but I don't remember all the stuff to teach it. On the flip side of, if you can't explain something, you don't know it, those who can do and those who can't teach, which is ludicrous. And my wife, who is a teacher, would slap me silly, rightfully so, if she heard me say that. Anyway, I always get a little bit, I feel pantsed a little bit when I'm like, oh, how to explain this? I would need to have charts and graphs and props. Hey, Mike Heugel. I don't have, I'll see, I am less familiar with the Portaflex PF20T and PF50T than I am with the B12 or B15, so I cannot answer your question. I would have to have much more experience with those Portaflexes than I do with the B12 and B15. Most of the ones that have come in have just been B15s and occasional B12, and then a lot of SVTs, and then a lot of later amps. But I don't have as much experience with the PF series 20 and 50, sorry. I have never worked on a Fender Cybertwin. I have had someone bring a Fender Cybertwin in, and the pots no longer turn, and I said, it is dead. I'm sorry, I cannot fix that because those parts have not been available for forever. Hey, Steve Smith asked a question about the Deluxe Reverb fizzing again. Please, everyone, remember that when you ask a question, I'm answering them in order that I see them on the screen. So in order that they're asked, it may be a few minutes, 20 minutes later in the chat, 40 minutes before I get to it, but I will get to it. But please only ask it the once, because it's hard for me to get through the clutter. Hey, Mr. Al. Happy New Year to you as well. Yeah, I've got some videos on upgrades for the deluxe reverbs, and they're not promising you mojo. You know, they're just saying, hey, these are reliability upgrades. And when it comes to the mids pod, it's a flexibility upgrade. And when it comes to cutting a trace on the board and installing a shielded cable, it's just a lower noise because they ran a trace in the wrong place on the board. But I've got videos up which show how to do that, specifically on the reissued deluxe reverbs. And the 59 reissue Bassman is really nice. I've got a fairly recent set of videos on a 59 reissue Bassman, and I was comparing it to an actual 59 that I had here at the same time. Let's see. Can a power transformer secondary go south without changing its resistance? Both read 43 ohm, but give nothing out on solid state rectifier. Old diodes were good, new diodes changed. Okay. Yeah, there's a resistance. When you measure the resistance, you're measuring the resistance cold with no voltage. So you can have this resistance when it's cold, but when it's got current through it, there can be a short, and you can't really measure the resistance while the voltage is present. I would just say measure the secondary, and if you have AC on the secondary, but you're not getting DC out of the rectifier, and you've got like 350, and 0 on the secondary, something else is up. But if you're not getting 350 per side from secondary to center tap, or if you're using, it depends on if you're using a full bridge or what, but resistance measured when it's not powered on is not as important a measurement, unless you're just getting a dead short, as the voltage is. So if you measure a secondary and it measures okay, but the voltage is way off, that's the important thing. Primary resistance is more important than secondary resistance typically. Primary, just so you don't waste some fuses. Thanks, Josh Bittner. Appreciate that much. I appreciate that very much. Blue Stripe DRG with Channel 2 mod. Okay, yeah. I'm glad those cap changes I gave you for your Mesa will absolutely not change the sound of the amp, unless you have hum and buzz from leaking DC in the 400 volt caps. But they will prevent you from having a very expensive thing go boom, which is always nice. Audio integrated amp question, JDS asks. 2 to 3 second start delay takes 3 to 5 minutes now to engage. Cap resistor or transistor problem? Wow. I would have to. No problem, Steve Smith. It's cool. No problem. I would have to see the circuit to see what they're doing, whether they're doing with a relay, whether they're doing with a MOSFET. There are a lot of ways to do a delayed start. It could just be a faulty thermistor. There are like 4 or 5 ways off the top of my head to do that. I'd have to know what amplifier it is, look at the schematic. But it's very few of the delay start circuits are that complicated or that complex. So you're probably going to be looking at maybe 5 to 6 components typically. Transistors are likely. If there are any electrolytics, those are likely. Resistors you can measure, but I can't give any more information without knowing the schematic. Brad, you should not buy a Triumph Bonneville. Motorcycles are hideously dangerous, but you know that. You're not going to listen to me anyway. DeLon Simpson, I don't know where to get a JSM 800-2203 kit to build, other than I'd send you to Mojo Tone. My wife was in a terrible motorcycle accident when she was 24, and she nearly died. And it's amazing that she did not. And she did nothing wrong. She was hit by a drunk driver in a pickup truck when she was 24 years old on a stupid Ducati. And so in a world where rain and cars do not exist, motorcycles are fine. But since we are likely to have rain and great big trucks for a long time. Thanks, Surge98. Appreciate that. Well, that makes me feel better. As I was just saying, sometimes I feel like I'm a fraud because I can't succinctly explain something like, Mr. Wizard or something. But thank you. I think in practice, I'm good. I think the practical side of things I'm quite good at. The theoretical stuff, let's put it this way. When Uncle Doug does one of his videos where he's got all the diagrams and charts and stuff, he's planned that all out. He wasn't being asked that on a live stream. So it's good to have the ability to research before you present yourself as, I am the knowledgeable source. I'm just being realistic. I know a lot of stuff that I don't even remember why I know it. It's like, driving. You don't think about, okay, I'm looking in that mirror, then look in this mirror, and then I'm going to, look at the horizon. Things you think about when you're learning how to drive, but once you do it, you just do it. And it's really hard to say. I mean, can you tell someone verbally or written form only how to tie their shoes and have them do it successfully? There are things that we do without thinking about, and there are things that we learn and incorporate without being able to necessarily verbalize in great detail. At least for me. Are the Burns 17 millimeter diameter pots okay quality-wise using a semi-hollow? Hey, Travis, quality-wise, yeah. In terms of taper, you may not be happy with the taper. And the rest of it's going to depend on the shaft diameter and what size hole you have in your hollow body. Given that, to me, in a guitar, especially a 335 or similar hollow body, where it's really hard to change those out, I want a pot that's really good quality, where I know the taper is going to be good, and I know I like the torque. So I tend to use the Mojotone vintage tapers and some CTS low torques, depending on what you're doing, because I don't want to have a tone knob that spins if I look at it, and either do I want something that I can't sweep. I'm very particular about what resistance I want on a pot, not in terms of impedance, but in terms of the torque necessary to turn it. And I'm very particular about, hey, on an audio taper or J taper pot, turning it down to 7 should give me this different sound in the amp. And that's the kind of thing that's very difficult to get out of a 17 or 16 millimeter pot. Typically, you have to go to some higher end 24 millimeter pots, CTS, and variations like that. A lot of the pots that were available 5 years ago for guitar are not on the market anymore because of COVID. I think Emerson's gone. It's tricky. But in terms of quality, in terms of, hey, this works and will continue to work, the Burns 17 millimeters are fine. I would just probably expect to go to their 24 millimeters if you want a little more control. Abstract asks, how does the 2x12 DeVille compare to Blues Junior on value and quality? It's a better value because it's not a lot more expensive, but you get a lot louder amp with more speakers and better speakers and a better sounding cabinet. In terms of quality, they're both built terribly. Both of them are absolutely ripping you off as far as what you pay for. I would not recommend either amp. But considering that for the price of a new Blues Junior, you can get a used 2x12 DeVille. The issue, of course, is the DeVille on the clean channel doesn't have a master volume, so it's going to be too loud for certain places. And the Blues Junior does have a master volume, so maybe the better amp for your needs is just a very boxy sounding cabinet. Both of them are built horribly. I would not recommend either. See my Amps Under $500 video and Amps Under $1,000 video for some better options in the same or less price or lesser price range. Let's see. Hey, Mike Santorini just got his 68 dual Showman back from a recap. First in 68. Notice that the volume knob doesn't produce sound until I turn up to 3 or more. Is that a potentiometer issue? Well, did it used to do that? Did it used to have sound below 3 or more? It's possible that the tech had to change out that volume pot, and if you used a current production CTS 1 meg audio taper pot, they don't have any change below 3, below about 8 o'clock, 8:30 o'clock. And it turns out thank you, John Cordy. It's intentional on the part of CTS because the wafer that's inside that pot and the 500K pot is the same wafer they use for their switch pots. So when they do it in a switch pot, they just cut the trace. Or they do it so that as it goes down to 0, there's no change on the carbon track in that last little bit of turn, which makes it very good for them to be able to use the same wafer in multiple pots, depending whether it's switched or not. From our perspective, it's frustrating because like nothing. Wow, that's loud, because it just jumps up. And so I prefer, and this sounds crazy to people, I much prefer the much less expensive Alpha 1 meg audio taper pot to the CTS 1 meg audio taper pot. But the pot I actually use in a Fender is neither. For the volume and treble on a Fender like yours, 68 Dual Showman, I would use the CTS made, sometimes it's Fender branded, sometimes it's CTS branded J taper, which is 30%. And that's what they actually used back in 68. So a J taper volume and a J taper 250K on the treble. But if you had to change your volume pot, that's what's going to happen. From an icy cold Stockholm, -8. Yikes. We're just looking at travel videos, planning on what we're going to be able to do on our next international trip, maybe next year. And I don't think I'll be making it all the way up to Stockholm, but Amsterdam is very much in contention. Amsterdam through Normandy is our general idea. And end up in one more day or so in Paris. But we're a long way from achieving that. But it's nice to dream. But we have been looking at Stockholm and Oslo and Copenhagen, and once you're there, once you get to mainland Europe, it's so inexpensive to get to other places, and we want to see as much of the world as we can afford to. But I won't be coming any places -8 or -20. Dustin, where the hell are you where it's -20? And I hope you're talking about Fahrenheit. Jesus. Yeah, ultralinear is a bit difficult to describe the how. Hey, Billy McIntosh, just got into playing electric guitar, bought a new 64 custom reverb. Any mods you should make to it in the future? No, there are no mods you should make to your amp, especially if you just started playing electric. Just play it. See how many sounds you can pull from it. Set, the treble and bass to about midway, and the reverb to maybe just under 3, and see how many sounds you can get just with your fingers, with this. Versus just learn the amp, learn how the guitar reacts into the amp. Because if you're coming from primarily playing acoustic, it's an entirely different ball of wax. And the 64 Princeton reissue that you have is not a bad amp. Does not need to be modded. It needs to be played, and you will get much better use of your time playing it than will throwing money at it trying to make it something else. I'm not a big fan of the hand-wired 64 in terms of what you get for the money, but you won't. It has a good sound, does not need to be changed, and it's not going to catch on fire or anything. Mark, I would need to know what your power transformer secondary AC measures, right where it connects to the diodes. as opposed to the 119 volts out. There's a lot of reasons it could have only 119 volts out, but I would need to know what the input would be. So typically, you want nominally 1.41 times the AC is what your DC would be after rectification. So, that's if you have 300 volts coming in, you should be able to guesstimate, to multiply that times 1.41. That should be your rough B plus. If you're really low, it sounds like you're about half of that. You may have something drawing way too much current downstream of that. So pull the output tubes and check that. But I would need to know what your AC is on the output of the secondary. Let's see. What does blocking distortion sound like? Sometimes it'll sound like a fizz that goes away, or it'll be like you play a note and it kind of goes, and then all of a sudden the tail of the note opens up and you hear it. Sometimes it's just kind of everything gets small when you play a note and then it opens up. There are some different symptoms of it. Sometimes it just sounds like like there's a megaphone in your amp. It just constricts everything. It'd be hard to describe, really. But typically, if I'm getting blocking distortion, it's going to depend on how hard you play. Like if I play real soft and the note comes through fine, then I play hard and the note kind of chokes and kind of goes, yeah. That's a typical experience of blocking distortion. I know I've shown that in videos, but it's the kind of thing that you can only show when there's a fault. It's really hard to generate that fault. Hey, John L. Happy New Year to you too. What is the difference between a top boost circuit and, say, a Fender Deluxe Princeton tone circuit? Well, the circuit itself is pretty much the same. The top boost circuit in the Vox is much more like the tone circuit of the 5F6A Bassman than it is a Deluxe or Princeton, but they're not dissimilar. You still have the input. In the case of the Princeton or the Deluxe Reverb, it's coming from a plate. In the case of the AC30, it's coming from the cathode. It's cathode follower stage, like you'd find in a Marshall or a 5F6A Bassman. Then you have a treble cap, a slope resistor, a mids cap, and a bass cap. And you have two pots in this case, like the Deluxe Reverb, one for treble, one for bass, and then a fixed mids resistor. The primary differences are the value of the caps. So you have 56 picofarad versus 250 picofarad, or 47 picofarad versus 250 picofarad for the treble. You've got dual 22 nanofarads for the Vox versus the 47 and 100 nanofarad for the Fender. And you've got dual 1 meg audios for the top boost versus 250K for J taper for the treble and 250K audio taper for the bass in the Fender. The Fender is going to have a fixed 6.8K mids resistor, and Vox has a 10K mids resistor, but they got it wrong the way they wired it. It's wired across two of the lugs of the bass pot, so it's a little bit wonky. Where it's like changing the taper of the bass pot more than being a separate mids resistor. And then, of course, Vox being weird, they wired the taper of one of the pots backwards. But electronically, they're doing the same thing, doing it in a different way. It is easier to get a good sound with the Fender. Or let me put it this way. With the Fender, it's harder to get a bad sound. It's real easy to get a terrible sound out of the AC30 circuit, but it's also possible to get some really great sounds, but they're very close in terms of o'clock position to sounding like ass. So there's a bigger learning curve with the Vox. It's a very weird primitive circuit that just sounds great until it doesn't, in which case, doc, it hurts when I do this, don't do that. Let's see, where was I? This is where John joined us. All CBS strats are crap. That's nonsense, Jeff. There's great CBS strats out there. Lots of CBS. I mean, Hendrix did 99% of his stuff on CBS strats. So I don't mean to be mean. Do I think Friedman's are good quality there using a PCB? Verona Tragedy. Yes, Friedman makes great stuff. There's nothing wrong with a PCB. A well-designed PCB is infinitely better than a poorly designed hand-wired amp. And there is an argument to be made that a well-designed PCB is better than a well-executed point-to-point or hand-wired design, because if the person designing it is really good, they can make 1,000 amps that all sound like each other. Whereas when you're doing hand-wired, you're introducing a lot more variables, and you can have, that one just that wire was a little too close to that wire, or wasn't close enough, or we used half-inch too much wire here and it changed the sound. These things, it sounds like I'm making stuff up. It can matter. So when you have a really great design and it's locked in with a PCB where every one of them is going to be the same, you can achieve a better consistent sound. And the issue is that PCB is often correlated with low-cost stuff, because no one's going to make an inexpensive hand-wired amp. It's all going to be PCB. And so you get bad things. You get bad amps, bad products made with cheap PCBs. But I'm telling you this, speaking into a microphone, which is going to a Motu M2, which is full of PCBs, and you're seeing me through a Sony camera with its PCBs, and I'm running into a MacBook Pro with its PCBs, and it's going through the internet with its PCBs to a satellite with its PCBs to tell you how great hand-wired sounds. You know, if everything that I do on the channel that you hear, that anything that you hear ever on the internet sound good to you, that's going through PCBs. There are good and bad ways to do it. And if I were doing the same thing, I've got like $150 HP laptop over there that I just use for a few old programs that don't work on the Mac, and it's the cheapest laptop. If I were doing the same stream on that $150 HP as I am here, you would not be seeing or hearing anything because it cannot do it. That's the difference. So you get the cheapest cheap and the expensive. They both have PCBs in this case. Amps, there's the perceived level of quality. So hand wiring today can be used the same way Rolexes are marketed to say, hey, we're doing it the old way. This is inherently better because it looks like the old stuff. And some companies actually are doing that well. But a lot of companies like Fender are saying, hey, we got this hand-wired thing. We're going to charge an extra $1,000 for it. And it's a piece of shit. It's not wired any better or made any better by any metric than the PCB version for $1,000 less. Anyway, I think I've beat that horse pretty thoroughly. Dave would not make an amp with PCB if it was not going to result in a good amp. We're going to come back to Strum Bum in a few minutes. We're going to take the first 7-minute intermission. Everyone can stretch their legs, get a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do, and I'll see you back in I suppose that we have enough people here that I don't need to keep you waiting. I stretch my legs, so anyone else is still a minute away, we'll catch up with us. That's a very stratty Strat. It does look pretty. This is Light Relic. I was talking to Chris. All will be revealed when I do the video, but when he sends out a guitar like this, he sends out one of the relics, because the new, if he sends out one, he does new, condition, and all kinds of different relicing levels, but he sends out the ones that are already dinged up for review, because odds are they're going to get dinged up, which makes sense. Verona Tragedy, this is a K-line Springfield, and I need to call Chris and ask if this neck has been roasted. The body is roasted pine. It's like just under 6.5 pounds. It's one of the lightest Strats ever that I've ever encountered. That's not Polonia. It's interesting. My 19-year-old Eric Johnson Strat is over 7.5 pounds. I haven't weighed it in forever. That 83 Fullerton, which is alder, the same as my Eric Johnson, doesn't weigh a lot more than this, because it's just been played for so long it's dried out, and that's a wonderful thing. But you know, this out of the gate feels like an old, really well played guitar without any of the, you know, this has immaculate frets, immaculate fret ends. Plays in tune, really well set up. I only tweaked it a little bit for my preference. The intonation was great. The nut is great. It's and given what the custom shop from Fender charges, this is so much better than most custom shop Strats, which cost quite a bit more. But anyway, all that can wait. I'm not just gushing. I have some niggles about this that I'll get into in the review as well. But you know, at some point it becomes more personal preference than actual criticisms. But it's really nice to see something made so well, and I was very honored that Chris reached out to me, and more to come. Apparently, they liked the Yamaha review, and they liked some of the pickup reviews I've done, and that I'm not just like blowing smoke, and that I didn't want to be paid or asked to keep the guitar or any of that stuff. It's not going to be sponsored in the slightest. So if you can give me a like, I don't do any sponsor reviews, so I'm cutting myself off from all the easy revenue streams that are out there. So let's see. Strumbum got this clean 68 Deluxe Reverb, 2-prong and all original electrolytics. Is it safe for you to plug into it? The best way to test, if you want to test it, though, you should absolutely have it changed to a grounded safety cable as soon as possible. And I've shown how to do that in many videos. The way to test it to make sure you have it as safe as possible for you is to plug it into the wall with the amplifier off. And you have a 2-prong, which can probably go either direction into your outlet. Get a meter and measure from ground in your outlet to the metal chassis of the amplifier. And if you have it correct, you're going to have like maybe 2 or less volts of AC potential there. If you flip the plug around and measure it again, you'll have whatever your wall voltage is of potential, so like 120 volts potential. So if you measure from chassis to actual ground and you have 120 volts potential, reverse the plug, flip the plug over so you have like 2 or less volts potential. That will be not only the one which is safer for you, it'll also be much quieter. So that's the test, but you have to do that with a meter. If you don't have a meter, and you're careful not to touch the chassis of the amplifier and anything else in your environment which is grounded, then whichever one is quieter is the one which is proper. You can also use the polarity switch at that point. But you don't want to have any potential voltage from the chassis to ground. And that's going to be separate from the polarity cap on back. That polarity cap on back is not going to be reliable. That's why it's called a death cap. If it shorts, then that whole chassis could be live, and that 120 volts would no longer be potential. It would be, it's going to happen. Hey, Gringo Pig, I need to check out your video on all your guitars. Let's see. I think I made my point poorly about PCB amps, but my point being that I intended to make was if I tried to do this live stream with that cheap HP, and I had 480p quality max and just sounded and looked terrible because it couldn't stream, and the average person would say, "Oh, it's because it's PCB." Get a handwire computer and be fine. No, this MacBook Pro uses a PCB and it can do all this stuff. So, I mean, that was my bad example. We tend to buy cheap things, especially in guitar world, and then expect great things from them. And then, anyway, let's see. I'm not a big fan of the diesel stuff, 5150 EJH. The ones I've had in have had some really wonky decisions made and really tiny little pots. I'm not a diesel fan, but there are guys who love them. Hey, Matt Johnson. I've got a whole bunch of stuff I want to get finished, and I need to do that 5E3 build for the charity giveaway that I planned to do last spring, and this year has just gotten away from me. I've got all the stuff lined up, but I got to say that the charity I was going to work with, and still very much want to, have been very difficult in terms of communicating, because I want to do a giveaway for charity, but I don't want to have anyone's money or access to anyone's financial information. I want it to be transparent to the people participating, and totally oblique to me, because I don't want any accusations of anything squirrely. So I wanted to have the charity collect directly all, raffle tickets or whatever. I'm not sure what I can and cannot call it, but basically you make a donation to the charity, and you are entered into a chance to win the thing, and they would always have the money, 100% of it, and I would never be involved in that. And they have not been very easy to work with on that. So that was been a thing. The amplifier building part is easy. Building a 5E3 Deluxe right is fairly simple, and I think people would enjoy the process, and it would sound great, and someone would be able to chance to win that amp at the end of it. And a charity would probably raise $5,000 or more, I think, for that. Maybe much more, depending on how many people enter. But I may have to find a different charity that's easier to work with. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's enough on that. But that's a thing I'm looking forward to. Hey, RJB, thank you. Yeah, I've tried the ToneMaster Deluxe. I've heard that the Super is better than the Deluxe. I've got a video where it shows me just going to a guitar store and trying one with my iPhone for audio. And aside from the iPhone audio compression, the Deluxe, at least, is really compressed. So you dig in and the amp just squashes, like having a Dynacomp built into the thing. And it may be that that's part of the circuit to limit it to 22 watts. I have heard, but I have not experienced from other people, that the Super Reverb, it doesn't have that compressed squash feeling. I have not tried the Bassman because it seems ludicrously overpriced. I have a fundamental issue with, I have several fundamental issues with the ToneMaster series, but if I were going to go digital, I would not want a digital amp that did one thing. I would want, for that money, you can get a fractal setup and have everything. But, when you get into digital stuff seriously, then you're like, all right, am I going to use in-ears? And that's an entirely different rig. Am I going to bring a little PA? That's an entirely different rig. So I see the advantage maybe of the Tone Master, but I still think that I'd rather, if I wanted to do that, I'd buy a Boss Katana and run a Tone X into its effects loop or something. Get to the same place, have a lot more sounds for a lot less money. So I'm not a big, thank you for your kind words. I'm not a big fan of the Tone Master. I've only played the one. And like Brad just says, he's seeing dead and irreparable Tone Masters, 1 or 2 a month these days. As I said in the first video, where I just was looking at how they were built and designed, they look like they're not going to last any longer than, I'm going to say a cell phone, but I've had the same cell phone for 4 years now. They're meant to be disposable. If only it were a euphemism, John. A while back, I discovered that there was a leak in our bathroom. It was coming from the toilet drain, and it had rotted out the subfloors, and I found out that it was not the only problem. And so I thought I was just going to have to clean things and change out some linoleum. And I'm rebuilding that wing of the house now. So you can find those videos if you want to see someone truly, truly suffer. Hey, Queen Hillbilly says, I think without the filtering, you can't really trust any DC readings because there will be a lot of AC present. I'm trying to remember if Mark N's question was the one I was talking about with I need to know the secondary measurement. If you are measuring the output of diodes and there is no filter capacitor connected, you're going to have an incorrect reading. That rectified voltage will be artificially low if it's not connected to a capacitor for a filter cap. So I was assuming that you're measuring it in circuit and the filter cap was connected. So Queen Silberl, you might have stumbled on something you really need to know. And it can be a big voltage increase once that capacitor is there. It's due to the way rectification works, and it's a longer subject than I can get into right now. But yeah, Queen Hillbilly is absolutely correct. Hey, Matt Johnson. Yeah, my friends and family in New Orleans are fine. It was awful. I don't know if this is the channel for these things, but it just seems so pointless. I still don't know whether the Tesla in Vegas was a bomb or whether it was just a Tesla. They got too hot. I shouldn't make jokes about such things. Those Cybertrucks are such hideous things and rust buckets already. Speaking of things being destined for the junk pile. Thank you, Ben Amos. Ben Amos? Amos? Either way, thank you very much, Ben. Hey, Taylor Mutt. He's got a 66 Gibson GA15 Explorer. He knows the tremolo is not really audible until the depth is above 5. I think everything else is working properly. Why would you design a tremolo circuit that way? Tremolo depth can be tricky, and to get a circuit to work, you might need a potentiometer that does not exist. And given that the Gibson GA15 was kind of one of their budget, just above student models at the time, they weren't going to special order a pot that gave 0 to 10 the entire range. If they could get what they wanted out of the top half of an existing pot, they would. So the nice thing about that is that you can get real subtle. You have good control over the subtle range. But, a lot of stuff in the 60s Gibsons was very much compromises made for budget, and that's one of the examples there. So it was not designed to be that way. It was designed to work with whatever pots they already had in stock and could order and get without custom ordering anything. Hey, John, he's got a question. Yeah, there's a 65 basement near him for less than a grand. It's mostly stock, mostly. Would I give it a go? Yeah, a 65 basement is one of the absolute best amps Fender ever made. It'll do bass phenomenally. It'll do clean guitar phenomenally, and then it'll kill a lot of Marshalls phenomenally. The issue with the AB165 basement is there are a couple. Number one, it had a couple of flaws in its design, which make the noise floor artificially high. I've shown how to fix that with some of my videos showing keeping the AB165 preamp, but changing the power, the phase inverter and output section to the AA864 version. And the thing they did with the 220K resistors on the plates and the positive feedback, and then inverting the speaker terminal, it was a weird design. It's one of the first weird CBS things, but that's easily undoable. And there's another thing with the filtering on V3A and B, a little trick I show in some videos. But the end result, even if you don't change it, even if you just do a fully restored AB165, once you get any stray DC out of the board, it's one of the best sounding, most versatile Fenders in the world. Do you know Chris at Rift Amps, John? Chris at Rift Amps would be a good person to have in your wheelbox. I'm not sure where in the UK he is. And also, I've got a friend, Roland Lumby in Manchester, who does phenomenal work. But you need to find a really good UK tech if you're going to be getting more vintage amps. That said, if you still have that you have a 65 Pro Reverb, except for the distortion stuff that the Basement does, that the Pro doesn't do. The Pro is one of the best amps, pretty much for large stages that there is. So, and given how much you have in the way of pedals, you might pass on the Basement. It sounds like from what you've been playing. Oh, yeah, good. You've been playing the Riff Matchless. Good. Get Chris to build you a deluxe reverb, because that's the amp that you really love, obviously from your most recent videos. And it will give you the sounds that your Pro Reverb does, but you can use it in the smaller clubs. I see you playing pubs and smaller places where the 40-watt Pro is too much, but the 22-watt deluxe reverb, and Chris can build you a deluxe reverb and make some tweaks for your playing and your voicing preferences that will kill anything that's available on the market or that Fender's ever made, unless you accidentally just get one of those that's just magical. So while I do love the AB165 Basement, given what you already have and the venues that you're playing, I think getting Chris to make a deluxe would be the thing. Have him make you a deluxe with a mids pot. Smile all the time. Let's see. All right, Mark N says that he's got a big drop with or without the rest of the filter circuit attached. All right, well, you could have a bad output transformer, Mark. If I had your amp here and I wanted to do a quick and dirty way to do it, I'll answer you about the boutique custom vintage in just a second, John. If I had your amp on the bench and I had that symptom, the first thing I would do would disconnect the diodes at where they come into. I would disconnect the secondaries, the HT secondaries. Make sure that the HT center tap is connected, unless it's a full bridge. Assuming you're saying it's two diodes, I would just do two diodes up in the air, going to a point, and I would connect a 500 volt, 50 microfarad cap to that, and then to ground. I just have a node not connected to anything, and I'd see what that was. And if the voltage was low there, then I would know that that secondary cannot provide the current. That secondary is collapsing when current is asked of it. If it does have high unloaded B+ there, say I'm getting 450 volts, whatever, then I would say, all right, something is drawing down that current when it's in the actual amplifier. So I would if it has a standby before the screen node, I'd keep it, switch on standby, or I disconnect the screen node, or test it without power tubes. Find what's drawing all that current. But the first thing to do is just test that. Okay, can the secondaries feeding diodes and one capacitor not connected to anything else maintain the high B+. I wouldn't always say custom boutique over vintage. I would say, given the inflated value right now on the market of a vintage 60s deluxe reverb, or even a 70s deluxe reverb, once you put the work into making it as good as possible, since you already have you already know Chris, and you have a relationship, I know that I could make you a deluxe reverb for about $2,700. I imagine Chris can as well, in a similar price range once you convert to pounds. So $2,700 for a world-class amplifier versus probably $3,000 to $4,000 for the vintage example of the same circuit. And Chris might work with you a little bit, since you would be able to probably sell a lot of Rift amps. I can't speak for Chris. It's something you should look into. Either that, or have ask Chris. Hey, if I were to buy this 72 deluxe reverb, can you? What would it cost? What would you charge to bring it up to perfect state? I would skip any Fender after 72 unless you have to. Just because in 72, the baffle changed from screwed in place to cleats to dadoed and glued in place. They started adding tons of wax on the board in 73. And then I think in 74, 75, they started doing a separate baffle for the grill cloth. Issues creep in. So 72 and earlier, vintage is great, but you're going to look at, in America, $200 to $400 to make it keep going. So that's what, 300 to 500 pounds, maybe more. Versus, all right, 2,500, so what, 2,000, 2,500 pounds for something that'll never have a problem for the next 30 years. Let's see. I'm not sure that Mr. Dumble, Howard Alexander, was genius. I think he was he was in the right place at the right time to meet a lot of great players, and his amps sounded good, if not always for the reasons he told people they did in terms of crystal matrices and stuff. But I think if you have any good builder, say it's Chris at Rift Amps, say it's Brad there in Sydney, Australia, well, Emu Plains, let's call it Sydney for clarity's sake, and the next Larry Carlton, and the next Robin Ford, and the next Stevie Ray all happen to use a Rift amp or a Brad's Guitar Garage amp, a lot of people are going to come beating a path to those particular doors, hoping that they can buy that. I have said this before, I have a lot of respect for Dumble and what he accomplished. I also know that Robin Ford would blow your mind with a 66 Super Reverb entirely stock. It's not the amp unless the amp is getting in the way of the player. So with any really good amp, a really great player is going to sound perfect. Larry Carlton's best solo, in my and many people's opinion, was Kid Charlemagne. That was a 5E3 Tweed Deluxe, not a Dumble. And a Dumble won't sound like that. And if you have a Dumble or you have a Tweed Deluxe and you have a 335, you won't sound like Larry Carlton. I have a 335, and I've played and restored many Tweed Deluxes, and I have yet to sound like Larry Carlton, which makes me sad. Because you think I could buy, if anyone could buy their way to it, I'm right there. I got the 335. I got these great amps coming in all the time. I just never sound like him. But if Larry Carlton came over and I had that Tweed Deluxe I restored, and he grabbed my 335, and I stick that Royer on there, he'd sound just like himself. It's what I do with the amps, what Chris does, what Brad does, and what Howard Alexander did is not do something genius to make a player sound different. It's that we finesse the circuit so that there are not obstacles between the great player, what they hear in their head, and what comes out of the box on stage behind them. So if you can just get all the obstacles out of the way so they hear it in their head, they've put in the hours of practice to do what's necessary on the guitar to make that happen, then it happens. And you don't have intermodulation distortion, and you don't have blocking distortion, and you don't have any 60-cycle stuff, in your case, John, 50-cycle stuff, riding the tails and interacting with stuff. Just get all that stuff out of the way and simplify it so that you don't have to futz with the knobs. You don't have to dial it in. You just, set the treble and bass to noon, and maybe turn the treble up just a hair. Okay, neck humbucker, turn the bass down to just below noon. It sounds perfect. You don't think about it anymore. You don't think about the box anymore. You're thinking about, oh, that drummer just did this thing. I need to do a call and response to that. Oh, the bassist just changed the route. Well, what should I do? Or what is the girl in the third row wearing? Whatever your creative priorities are, you're not in the position where you're observing yourself. You're performing, you're in the moment, you're not watching yourself or observing yourself doing it. Because as soon as you're in clinical mode and you're thinking about the amp or thinking about, I need to turn the reverb down before the next chorus, you're not creative mode anymore. So stay in creative mode, and that's what a great amp lets you do. So that's what Alexander Howard did, and that's what anyone who cares about this, who's good at this, does, is just take those blocks between the creative and the realization away. Hey, Steve Sparks. Avoid all Morgan amps in my sad experience. I have not had the AC20 in. I've had several other Morgans in, and they were really poorly built, with filter capacitors not rated for the voltage present, just amateur hour. Maybe he's fixed all that. Maybe the AC20 is magically great. I would be pleasantly surprised if that is the case. For that price range, you could get two Vox AC15 C1Xs with blue speakers. Those are phenomenal amps for the price. You get very similar aesthetic and sound-wise amps from Dr. Z that are made, like a brick shit house. I just don't understand the Morgan hype out there, because I've been inside them. I see how those particular sausages are made. Hey, Verona Tragedy, thanks for that. The Randy Rhoads tone, that's really tricky, because the Randy Rhoads tone sounded a lot like, it was just, he had a really noisy rig. He had a really noisy pedal board. He had way too much gain. I'm not sure how much he actually used that Randy Rhoads modded at Marshall sent to him. But I have read the articles of the engineers having to do noise gates and all kinds of stuff, and trying. They called it his setup, I think, the frying pan or the skillet. If he had lived, he probably would have gotten to a point where he had an amazing tone if you're in the room. But what's on the records is fairly sculpted by the engineer and the mastering, and it's kind of thin with a lot of effects piled on, and you don't hear all the white noise and stuff because of the way the drums are going. And I'm not criticizing Randy Rhoads, and I'm not criticizing or putting down anyone who loves that sound, because that sound had impact. But that was a sound on record that was did not exist in the room, and what existed in the room when he was on tour, he had not achieved what he would have wanted to have. He died tragically way too soon. If he made another 5 years, he probably would have been one of those guys with like the ADA MIDI preamps and a rack unit, and he would have sounded really good. He would have, let me put it this way, he would have probably achieved the sound he was going for without all the in the background. So the Randy Rhoads tone does not really exist in an acoustic space with just a guy with a guitar and an amplifier. On the Randy Rhoads head, when I was done with it, I thought it did a better version of what Marshall was pushing for, because it had sensible has sensible gain structure, and was not clipping in bad places. So I thought I dramatically improved that. But if someone wanted to sound like Randy Rhoads, it's like using imagination. You've got to imagine. Everyone's got a sense of what Randy Rhoads actually sounded like, and I'm not sure. That everyone's description of Randy Rhoads' sound would match each other, if that makes sense. I think you're chasing, if anything else, people are chasing a time in their life. They're changing the age they're chasing the age that they were when they loved that stuff, when they first heard that stuff. And I understand the inclination. Hey, Ramalama Ding Dong, thank you very much. I am a Leslie fan, though there was a particular period when it was overused. There are basically two really great standout uses of the Leslie for me. One would be the George Harrison thing, which is on Cream's Badge, and it's on a lot of All Things Must Pass. And then there's the faster Cold Shot thing. I guess Gilmore with the vibrating speakers as well, but that's a little more, his use was much more subtle. So the Cold Shot, fast Leslie. It's really tricky to do. Best way to put this. There are things which sound cool, and there are things which sound like Leslie, but if you're standing in front of an actual Leslie cabinet, you get an actual Doppler effect. And when you put a microphone in the mix, or stereo microphones preferably, you get much more of a Doppler effect. To the microphones, it has a more pronounced effect than it does to our ears in the room. It's really difficult to do that in the pedals. I have tried the Rotosphere back in the day. I have not tried everything that's on the market now. I've not tried the new Keeley. It depends really on how crucial it is to you to nail it, and how often you would use it, because it can go, oh, there's that thing again. It can be like a bad chorus setting. But I'm not up on all the current products. I know that the digital stuff is getting much closer. So I would avoid the Rotosphere. That was a very expensive mousetrap way to do it. Remember the old game Mousetrap, where you had to build this big elaborate set, and then at the end of it you finally get to make all the things fall down? Sorry to be less than fully informative on that. Sorry, I'm trying to think about what to say, and there are good ones and there are bad ones, and I've not personally heard one that sounds like plugging a guitar into a Leslie cabinet. But plugging a guitar into a Leslie cabinet, you got to use impedance adapter, and it's a problem. And then it's already been done so perfectly a handful of times that odds are you're always gonna be a pale impression of that. For most people, I think a Phase 90 or a Univibe would be able to get similar stuff, or just a tremolo can sound close enough for most people in the audience. But if you want to go for it, go for it. Hey, Richard, if you got an itch for a Soldano, get a Soldano. They're fantastic. I've not tried the new ones that are being made under the boutique amp distribution ownership, like the little 30 and the smaller ones. I've only played the Hot Rod 50s and the big old SLO 100s and all, the stuff that Mike was doing when he was just running Soldano by himself. They've been absolutely fantastic, really well built amps. They have some quirks and oddities to the way the clean works and the effects loop, but if you like that sound, that is that sound. Personally, if I had to play a Soldano 100-watt SLO, I would take out that 1 nanofarad bright cap. But other than that, it's a great sounding amp. Hey, Keith, thanks for joining us. Bonjour. How is Gay Paris? And please tell me you didn't bring the beret. Hey, Verona, I have not tried the Mazur Barber heads. Sorry. Danny Turner, I don't know which of the Friedmans would be the best for the AC/DC style music because I've not tried all the I can't talk. I've not tried all of the Friedman amps, but call Dave. He'll tell you. He'll say, "Hey, for AC/DC, this is the one," because he will know. Odds are, at some point, he's probably provided them backline. I know that of the Friedmans I have tried, all of them will get you kind of in that ballpark, but I've not tried all of the models he makes. And it also depends a lot if you want to be stage right or stage left in terms of the sound, because Angus and Malcolm had very different sounds. What makes a clean output section? Soldano claims that he likes his output sections hi-fi. The amount of negative feedback, the amount of distortion, the frequency response of the tubes, so that can be a little bit inflated or mythologized in all the various gear forums. The output transformer, how beefy it is, and how much it really passes a signal without compressing. How much the output tubes compress or don't compress. So you want to usually have high wattage for that, as high as screen voltage as possible, typical for the tube type. And then sometimes there are changes to the phase inverter, like AT7 designs versus 12AX7 designs. But what he's really talking about for most people is that there are amps like an AC30 or a Marshall 1959 or 1987, where if you were to turn down the preamp feeding into the output section, the amp really doesn't have a lot of distortion. There's not a lot of preamp distortion. The sound of the amp on 10 is that thing, which means the output section is working really hard. Whereas if you have a lot of distortion in the preamp, like, for instance, an SLO, then you don't need to have a lot of distortion in the output section. So you have a master volume before the phase inverter, and you can turn that down and still have a very distorted sound at low volumes because the output section is not a key component of that distortion sound. There are amps where, as you turn the master volume down, the amp cleans up a lot. For instance, a lot of the Top Hat amps do that. And that's one of the places where Brian at Top Hat and I differ. I don't like that. He actually likes the fact that the amp cleans up as you turn the master volume down. That's one of the weaknesses, beyond whether you like it or not. That's one of the true weaknesses of the Origin series from Marshall, is that as you turn the master volume down, it cleans up entirely. It becomes a dinky, terrible sounding thing. And if you turn it up so it sounds good, then it's too loud for most places because they used a terrible implementation of the master volume. So while there are things that make an output section cleaner or not, usually that's a reflection on how much gain is in the preamp. Hey, Richard, I don't collect vinyl. I'd like to have a turntable again at some point, but that's money I don't have to spend at the time, and I know I'd probably get way into it. I long ago transferred all my CDs to lossless, AIFF and WAV files, and I've got them all on all my devices in Apple Music, so I just play it on here. I'm Apple, MacBook, Moto M2, Yamaha HS7s. It sounds really good. The only thing I miss is on things like the American pressing of Rubber Soul or Stevie Wonder's Talking Book, where I miss the vinyl hiss sound, which is, nostalgia. It's not audiophile, it's just nostalgia. The thing about, you have to remember about vinyl is that it will sound better than any digital audio converter for the first 3 or 4 plays, and then the needle gets too much wear on it. And so from that point, it degrades. Well, actually, the needle deforms the vinyl. So vinyl for the first 4 or 5 plays can sound phenomenal if everything else is phenomenal. But after a while, that vinyl is no longer, it doesn't have the fidelity. So it's just a nostalgic take. A lot of the anti-digital stuff was based on things Neil Young said in 1987 when CDs the converters were terrible, and the record companies were just dumping stuff with existing tapes with preset EQ curves onto CDs just to have something out on the market. And so we got some really bad sounding records. But the stuff today, you can do stuff with digital that no one will hear the difference. And I'm quite happy with the way these HS7s sound here. I'm sitting a little to the left of center, but I'm sitting right here. I've got about as good as you can get without doing a ton of room treatment. Hey, John, he's got a Car Mercury 5. It's making an odd sound, lots of... it sounds like a fuzz crapping out. Does yours have reverb, John? Some of the cars with reverb are using the 70s Fender reverb circuit, where instead of having a 2.2K resistor bypassed with a 22 or 25 microfarad capacitor, they're just using an 820 or 680 ohm resistor for the reverb driver, and that resistor likes to burn and fail, and that could be throwing off other things, but I'd have to have your amp in front of me. It's got to be something simple, but I don't know what that is. Shoot me an email. Maybe we can work you in the next month or two. Cars are really well built. Also reach out to Mr. Carr. He might, I think his name is Steve. I'm sure he would be glad to help you. He might, he obviously knows that circuit better than I do. He might be able to step you through it over the phone, maybe recommend you to a tech in your area that he knows who could do the work. It won't be anything major. I have not tried the Bell Ray Zenobia. I've tried Mercury's and one other, or 2 or 3 others, but I don't remember what model numbers were. They were all little combos with 10 and 12-inch speakers. I've not tried a Bell Ray. Car makes really nice stuff. I have absolutely no problem with any of the Car amps that I've tried and had in here. I just don't like that choice you made on the reverb circuit, but that's really easy. You just change the single resistor for a 2.2 bypass with a 22 microfarad cap, and then all of a sudden the reverb driver lasts longer. But but the reason I mentioned that as a potential cause for everything you're having, if your Mercury 5 has reverb, is if that cathode is acting up, then that preamp driver tube, the AT7, can really be acting up and can draw excessive current, and it's going to draw that excessive current through the reverb driver transformer, which is going to be drawing excessive current from everything else, so your entire preamp B plus can be having spikes and weird things if that cathode is intermittent. All right, yeah, Brad so we're just now talking about the 18 and 17 millimeter burn spots. So Brad's liking the 18 millimeter tapers on the burn stuff, and yeah, running the same issue with CTS below 3 or 4. Hey, Jarafa. No, if you are using the attenuator, your tubes depending on how the attenuation is done on the Tone King, I don't know whether they're doing it as a load or whether they're doing it as a voltage reduction circuit. If you're using it with if it's a load attenuation, then the tubes are going to be working exactly the same as they would if you weren't using the attenuation, unless you're just turning the amp up to 1,000. If you're just slamming everything. You won't need tubes after 2 years. You may need tubes after 5 years. You may need tubes after 5 months, depending on the tubes that you have. But if you're playing it at your attenuated setting and you like the sound, everything's fine. If you start to get hum, or if one of the tubes starts to glow red, or you don't have a good output, that's the time to worry about it. Odds are nothing's going to go wrong that's going to cause any damage to the amp. Someday, if you need new tubes, it'll let you know in fairly friendly ways. But attenuate, if that's what you need to use in your living room, that's what it's there for. Thank you, Goody Guitars. Appreciate that. And for those wondering why it says pair character stretching his arm forward, raising his thumb up, that the app I use for viewing these chats doesn't get the super stickers visible. And if I were to scroll up on the one where it's live here, I've got a Chrome thing open where I see the chat as it happens, and I've got the chat where I'm actually responding, and it doesn't have super sticker compatibility. So I get pair character stretching his arm forward. But thank you, Goody Guitars. Let's see. Thank you, Ray. Yes, I appreciate that. We are coming up to our time for a second intermission. Let's see. Yeah, Mark, yeah, and something's up with yours, but like I said, connect a new cap to some new diodes just up in the air. Make sure the cap is grounded. It'll eliminate anything downstream of that from being the problem. And Ben Amos has sent another super sticker that we get, lemon character doing shoulder shimmy dance moves. I gotta say I like this because I'm not a big fan of emoticons or super stickers or any of the silly cartoon things, but I love the descriptions of them. And I love it's just such an odd thing to encounter in one's day. Also, lemon character doing shoulder shimmy dance moves. Let's do another 7-minute intermission, and we'll all be back shortly. Thank you very much. All right. Oops, wrong button. Not time for that message yet. It's time for this message. There we go. Came back early again because I always feel guilty if I don't answer any questions, or if I don't answer all the questions, rather. I mean, I should give myself a break. Not a lot of channels do regular 3-hour live streams without midstream ads, but I still feel guilty if I don't get stuff. Here's all the stuff to finish this Mesa Strategy 88. So that'll be later tonight. Maybe it'll be loud again soon. Let's see. Hey, Falcon Arcade Gaming. The negative feedback is totally independent from the fat switch. All the fat switch does is engage a cathode bypass cap. I find that the Blues Junior sounds better if you always have it in fat and just turn down the volume. You get a better bass response. But maybe that with that negative feedback, the output is just compressing so much you're not hearing that the preamp level is changing, but the output is compressing so you're not getting the benefit. You can always have someone put a switch in there to connect and disconnect the negative feedback. So you'd have 3 modes. You'd have normal, fat, and then no negative feedback. Binamos, that's fantastic. I'm so glad. Vibrolux is wonderful amps. I really like a Vibrolux. I think I might prefer the Vibrolux to the twin reverb. I'm not to twin, sorry, to the deluxe reverb. But I'm glad that we have both in this world. Hey, Strumbum. My favorite Fender tweed amp is probably the 5F6 Bassman, but again, it's giant. The Tremolux is kind of weak. The Harvard also is a little bit weak. I really like the 5E3 Deluxe. It has that really sweet clean, but then it gets gnarly. The Tremolux and the Harvard don't have the same amount of gain on tap, and they're very similar circuits otherwise. So if you can live without the tremolo, I think the tremolo can get a little bit glitchy on the Tremoluxes, the Tweed Tremolux as well. I would say the 5E3 Deluxe is the sweet spot with just a handful of basic pedals and life is good. But the big 5F6A and the 5F6E or 5E6A twin are the best ones, but you have to have a big old stage to play them. Hey, James Blessed. I'm doing very well. Hope you are too. Just got an AC15C2. What work upgrade should be asking a tech to do in the first instance? Thanks. Don't. Just make sure the input jacks are tight. Not over tight. Don't break them, but just make sure the input jacks are tight. And play it. A lot of the stuff I do that are upgrades are making it more like the JMI. And one of the things I do is I correct the phase the solid state circuit so that the effects loop and reverb and tremolo gives you a unity gain path, but it's kind of subtle. In stock form, the amp sounds really good. I wouldn't say that you need to change anything, and except for the tubes. The tubes are the one thing, because that ships with very inexpensive tubes, which have traveled thousands of miles to get to you. So if you were to just upgrade that with all new JJs, typically you'll have a much better sounding amp. A lot of the times the stock tubes in those are, and the preamp are relatively low gain. But the amp itself is a really good amp in stock form. It does not need anything to be made more reliable, and it does not need anything to sound better. The things I do make it sound a little bit different, a little more like the old JMIs, quite a bit more like the old JMIs in some ways. Have a little more versatility with the mids thing I do, and I do upgrade the screen grid resistors from 470 ohms to 2-watt 1Ks, but I've never had one come in with a blown screen grid resistor. I just do that as a matter of course because I absolutely know that they're going to last longer that way. Hey, Matt Kelly, where do I buy resistors and caps? What brands do I prefer? Mauser for the most part. and some stuff I get from CE Distribution, some stuff I get from Tube Depot, and a few other vendors. But primarily, I try to get almost everything from Mauser, and then after that, CE Distribution. Now, if you're not doing this as a business, you don't have a business license for this, your version of CE Distribution is called Antique Audio or tubesandmore.com. It's the same business. They just charge more for retail. And I like Vishay an awful lot in almost every category. I like the MOD caps that CE sells, which I use pretty much for axials, though I exclusively these days. So I still will use F&Ts where that's the only value that matches. And I like F&Ts for multi-section can caps, like in a Marshall, dual 50s and dual 100s. I've got some videos up on how I get parts at Mauser. I think it's, boring stuff, boring but important stuff. You can find it on my channel. And it shows how to find parts on Mauser because it's a very confusing site for a lot of people. But, you get a much better selection and much better prices on really good stuff, and you can see all the specs, but you have to put in some time. Yeah, if you're getting those voltages when you're using light bulb limiter, everything's going to drop way back. It's, it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. You've got to know how everything works. Light bulb limiters are great and useful, and you see me use it all the time, but I know I'm not going to have accurate voltages to measure. I just know rough ballpark, I'm not going to have a dead short or something that, it's not just fine and dead short. That's drawing more current than it should. And I can go in there and do a more accurate measurement of all that if necessary. But usually that's enough for me to say, okay, it's drawing more current than it should, or it's drawing way the hell too much current than it should. Let's see. Hey, Les Ghost. Are devices like the Amp RX that reduce voltage for tube amps important to use? It depends on the amp. 50s Fender was designed pretty much to have 110 volts feeding it. And if you give it 120 volts, not only will the bias range usually be off, either in cathode or fixed, but your heater voltage will be too high. And you don't want it to be higher than 6.7 volts AC on the heaters, typically. And so in that case, anything which lowers the wall voltage to what the amp was designed around can be a very good thing. 60s Fenders were typically looking for about 114. 117 is what it says on the back, but 114 typically is the goal. But those, if you adjust the bias, can work with 120. And newer amps work fine at 120. So it's not like you need to, hey, I got a brand new Friedman or I got a brand new Sir, I've got to lower the voltage to it. You can if you like the sound, but it's not necessary. There's no benefit to it. But if you have an older Tweed amp, that can be very important to do. Or it may be, as a rule of thumb, and this is what, if you're asking this kind of question, you should probably have a tech verify, is you want to find whatever wall supply voltage, mains voltage, puts the heaters at or very close to 6.3 volts AC. Now you can go lower, you can go higher than that, but don't go lower than like 5.9 and don't go higher than 6.7 unless you really know what you're doing. So if you have an amp and you plug it into 120 volts mains and the heater's 6.9 volts, find what mains gives it 6.4 or 6.1, in that range, and that's what you need to say. All right, I'm gonna get the Amp RX, I'll get the brown box and set it to 110. Life is good. Swarts are nice. Thank you, Daniel Anzovino. Appreciate that. Hey, Vinicius. Hey, Nowhere's My Home. Any tips on settings from guitar through NL and volume tone? I'm not your beginner. Hey, Marty. Happy New Year to you too. I'm not sure what you mean by NL. In general, let's see, on this Princeton right now, the treble is just above 4 because these Strats are a little bit bright and it's a brand new speaker. And the bass is at 5.5, which is noon on a Fender. And the reverb is just below 3. And I've got a Strat, and it sounds great. It doesn't have as much low end as one of the 12-inch speakers around here, or my 2x12, but for a Princeton, that's really good, and that's how it's set. And I find that one of the consistent things that makes great amps great, no matter the amp company or the style of music it's used for, is you don't have to think about too much. You turn it on, you set all the tone stuff about halfway up, and it should sound pretty much to what you're going for. Now, there are exceptions where you want to do something else, but in general, it's a good rule of thumb that most good designers for amps set it so that the sweet spot is right about midway on the pots, and then you just adjust from there. You don't have to do anything radical. I never use, if you're talking about tone circuits and guitars, I never use a linear taper, because if you do it, a linear taper in the tone circuit, you get all the tone change from 0 to 1, and then everything else is subtle. Linear taper is terrible for tone circuits. Most people don't understand how taper audio and linear taper and all that work. Linear is always a bad idea for a tone circuit, and it's only a good idea for a guitar circuit if you're not trying to change the sound or character of the amp. Like if you're playing jazz and you want to be able to go from 5 to 10 because you're comping and then you're going to do a solo and have the amp stay pretty much the same, that's great. It gives you all those great fine gradations between 5 and 7. It won't give you a good volume swell. If you're playing into a dirty amp, it won't clean up as you turn it down a little bit. If I had this amp cranked, or a Vox or Marshall that was gainy, and I had this Strat on 10, it would be distorted. If I turn the Strat down to like 6, it'll be clean. Whereas if there were a linear taper volume, I'd have to turn it down to like 1 to get anywhere close to clean. I'd have it'd be clean and off, and I wouldn't have any subtle variation. Pot tapers are very peculiar to the playing style as far as volume goes, but linear is horrible for tone. It's all bunched up between 1 and 0. Too much treble, Frederick. That shouldn't have too much treble. That's weird. What speaker do you have in that? Oh, treble and bass instead of 2 volumes and a tone knob. Okay, so that's not the 5E3 circuit. If they've added a tone stack, I don't know what Mojotone's done on that circuit. I'd have to look at it. Okay, I think it was just a 5E3. I didn't read the whole thing. Yeah, 5E3 would just have a tone circuit, not a treble and bass. Can a JCM 800 2203 be modded to sound more like a 60s Fender? No, no, they're very different animals. I mean, you could, but then it wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. If you want an amp that sounds like a 60s Fender and you've got a JCM 800 2203, sell the 2203 to someone who wants the 2203, and get a Fender or any of the infinite variations on the market. So sometimes it's much better to say, I'm not going to mod this. I'm going to trade this or sell this. I mean, if I want a Gibson that feels, plays, and sounds like a Fender, I need to not play a Gibson. I need to play a Fender. It's that same principle. Goody Guitars got to go start his slow cooker with beans and ham shank. That sounds pretty good. I'm still eating the black eyed peas I made for New Year's. I need to eat some of those greens I made too. I'm going to have all the luck and all the money. So far, I've had all the gas as well. It's a lot of black eyed peas to eat, but they're so tasty. Let's see. Scrolling down, trying to find the next question. I think I'm at one of the intermissions. Everyone's talking to each other. Mr. Tall Dogs, I have not had a chance to examine the new DGT-15. I have had the DGT-30 in, and it was really well built and designed and sounded great. And I imagine the 15 would be much the same, just a little bit less of it. So I think the DGT-30 is the best amp that PRS has made, and the DGT-15 looks like it is likely to be on that list as well, but I've not tried one yet or had it in yet. Hey, Ike. Got a Music Man HD 130 a couple months ago. Is the maintenance more or less like a twin? Try not to burp on you guys. The maintenance is very similar. Same thing with, the filter caps need to be changed. All the electrolytic caps need to be changed, typically. Pots need to be cleaned. Jacks need to be tightened. And much like a twin, on the HD 130, there's a board over by the output tube that has the bias stuff and a lot of the smaller electrolytic caps on it. And it's a fiber board, just like you'd find in a 60s Fender. And all the components, resistors and caps are running horizontally. And over time, those fiber boards get the wave, and all those solder joints like to crack. So every time I get an HD 120 or 130 in, I do the same thing I do with Fenders on horizontal runs where the board is waved. I remove the old solder. I make sure that everything has a mechanical connection, and then I resolder it, because half the time those leads have pulled out of the old solder joints, or things have just broken. Or sometimes there's DC built up. But yeah, once that's done, you're not going to have to change tubes very often, other than the power tubes in that thing. And you need, in the case of an HD 130, you're going to need a roadie to carry it for you. Hey, rock and roll Philistine. Good PCB design guidelines for guitar pedals. Wow, that'd be like a 30-minute discussion. In general, I would say, as a hint, especially in a guitar pedal, don't confuse ground with shield with DC negative. They're not always the same thing. Make sure that you understand the roles that ground is going to play. And sometimes you want them separate. Your shielding can be totally separate from an AC negative or a DC negative. Sometimes you'll join, but sometimes it's totally separate. I find in general, you will get great benefits from what I call a steered ground path. So rather than having a ground plane that everything that's at ground is just connected to, I will run a ground trace, and I will run it through the entire circuit from input to output, and everything connects in that sequence. And any filter caps associated with that are also connected in that sequence, just like you do in an amplifier at a much smaller scale. And then in terms of noise levels, all right, what is noisy, what's quiet in the circuit, what could be moved a quarter inch away from something else. The pots, and are the pots going to be directly attached to boards? They're going to have wires. If they have wires, how much slack can I get away with? Can I make sure that they're not near anything else? And one of the important things, really important things to do in a pedal, in my experience and in my opinion, is to say, all right, the incoming audio will be tied to the chassis only at the input jack. So the entire input jack is, the entire chassis is acting as a shield, and it's only tied to the input right at the input jack, but there is no audio path through that chassis to the output. And that cuts out all kinds of radio signals and interference on stage. And that's also how to make a wah stop picking up radio stations once you stop using the enclosure as a audio path. Beyond that, I've got some videos up where I show solving problems in a matchless pedal. And that was a pedal that used tubes, so it was an exaggerated example of the problems. But because it's very large and hand-wired on terminal strips, it's also a great way to show how when I'm using the same principles and fixing someone else's product, it's really audible. You can make a huge difference. And I talk about those same concepts. The same concepts that you use with the terminal strips and hand-wired stuff applies to a PCB. You're just locking in the concepts so you can make more than one quickly. Yeah, we're talking. So people are still talking about when I was mentioning I was going to be doing a review on the K line. So yeah, I may never catch up with where the chat's actually at. I'm going to try though. Let's see. Thomas C says, "Greetings from a place where it's negative 16 Celsius. Whew. I want to build my first amp kit. Most forums suggest starting on the 5E3, graduating to 18-watt Marshalls, but I will start on 18-watt. Do you have any thoughts?" Yeah, I would say don't even start on a 5E3. Start on a champ. And don't even start on a champ until you've built many pedals. I think the 18-watt is beyond most beginners' abilities to do well. And I think even the champ is beyond... I know it's beyond most beginners' abilities to do well because I've seen it butchered so many times. Learn how to solder by building pedals. Or just go make 100 speaker cables. I don't care what it is, but you want to get your soldering techniques together on something that is not going to have 400 volts in it, cannot kill you, does not have huge temperatures, things that'll burn. Make all your mistakes when it's cheap. Where, oh, darn it, I killed an 80-cent op amp, as opposed to, oh, darn it, I killed a $200 power transformer. Or, oh, darn it, I touched something together and it shorted, as opposed to, oh, I touched the wrong thing and now I'm dead. And I know that sounds hyperbolic or like I'm a crotchety old man or I'm gatekeeping or something, but seriously, before you play around with high voltage and high current and things that get hot and things that are expensive and things that can kill you, make sure you know what you're doing, and that if you make a wire connection, you're going to have a great solder joint every time, and that you've got the tools and you know how it all works. And then build a champ. And if that champ was just the easiest thing, you think, oh, that Lyle guy was nuts. I built it, no problem at all. Everything worked first try. I knew what I was doing. I understood everything I was seeing, and all my solder joints were great and had no issues at all. Then you can skip the 5E3 and go straight to the 18-watt Marshall. But most people will make mistakes on a champ. They'll get this wire backwards. Something will go wrong. Much easier to undo a simple circuit like a champ and learn. And then, okay, now I see what I went wrong. All right, I really should have understood this more. I should have spent more time on this. And then you do the 18-watt Marshall or the 5E3. Much more complicated circuit, many more opportunities for mistakes, much more expensive a proposition. What if you never finished the champ and you're like, I'm out $300? Well, you could have been out $900 if you'd done the bigger kit. So it's okay. There's no shame in easing into it. But seriously, I'd have someone show me that they can build a tube screamer in 1 hour and get it perfect before I'd say, now let's build a champ. Exactly, Dustin. All those consoles from the late 60s forward with PCB, SVTs or PCB. SVTs are actually a very bad PCB. All the Ampegs use terrible PCBs, but that's a reflection on Ampeg, not on PCBs. Hey, local Christian rock guitarist. Check out my videos on amps under 500 and amps under 1,000. I love the 1500 issue Bassman. and I love Bandmasters, and I love deluxe reverbs. Those are all very different volume levels for different stages. And a lot of stages today, if you show up with a 59 basement, if it doesn't have a master volume or you don't have an attenuator or some other way to keep it quiet, you will not get that gig. Of those amps, the 65 reverb, deluxe reverb is going to be the one that will get you the most gigs. Doesn't matter how awesome the 59 reissue basement can sound. If you get fired because you're too loud and you can't go below a certain level, So workhorse amp, it depends on the budget, it depends on the needs. So many stages now, you're going to get asked to turn down if you have a deluxe reverb on 3. So how cheap is too cheap for a decent LCR meter for occasional use? I don't know. I don't know what the prices are right now. It's so hard to keep up with that stuff. Just go with a brand that you know whenever possible. I don't use an LCR meter very often. Thanks, Oxen. Appreciate that. Hey, Imak J, he's not liking the bassy tone on the normal channel of a super reverb. Any suggestions? Well, I don't know what your super reverb it is. It should not be a bassy tone. It should be very similar to the reverb channel on a super reverb. You could have a faulty slope resistor. You could have a faulty 250 picofarad treble cap. You could have a bad treble pot. So it's a 75 super reverb. It should not be bassy. The one thing I will say about any of the 70s super reverbs, any of the 70s Fender amps, is when they change from the 1 nanofarad input cap on the phase inverter with 1 meg grid leaks on the phase inverter to the 330K grid leaks, they also changed to a 10 nanofarad input cap. They should have changed that to a 3.3. So when they made that change, they made the entire amp's output section accept too much low end. And so a lot of the 69 and later amps can be a bit boomy. So if you change the 10 nanofarad input cap to a 3.3 nanofarad input cap on those 70s amps, all of a sudden the thing it's going to sound a lot more like an earlier 60s amp. Second of all, sometimes starting in 70, Fender would be out of the correct taper pot, and they would use a linear taper instead of an audio taper. And so if that might be the case of what you're experiencing, you might have a 250K linear taper on your bass pot there, or they might have used the wrong value. You might have a 1 meg in there because by 75, they were using what they had on hand and taking shortcuts. And if it got out the door, it got out the door. But without having your amp in front of me, I cannot tell you other than to say it should sound a lot like the reverb channel, only without reverb. So something's up with yours. Eric, don't do a Dumble conversion to a hot rod. Just sell the hot rod and buy a good amp. I mean, my God, I've seen all these things, and people are always willing to sell stuff like that. Depends on what sounds you're trying to get from the Dumble. But if you for the same money as that would cost you, you could buy a ODS from Fuchs and have a phenomenal amp that'll actually do it. It'll have a resale value, unlike a modded hot rod. It's going to have much better transformers. It's going to have the controls all laid out correctly. The panel's going to match what everything does. That's not the kind of thing to do a kitchen table version of. Save your money. Either get like a real ODS circuit from Fuchs or someone like that, or just sell the hot rod and get a super reverb reissue and get a handful of pedals. Robin Ford, when he gigs his Dumble, he hasn't used the overdrive channel in a long time. The overdrive channel on his Dumble doesn't work anymore. He uses a Zen drive into the clean channel. Sounds just like himself. And the clean channel on a Dumble sounds a lot like a Super Reverb, depending on the speakers. Oh, the Marshall code. I'm sorry, Richard. Let's see. Thanks, Trumbo. I appreciate that. Let's see. Scrolling down, trying to get to the next question. Now, people talk about the Cybertruck. I'm never going to get caught up. I don't have any thoughts on Mojotone's Fender Blackface kits, Justin. I'm sure they're fine. I just haven't. I think the Mojotone kits I've had come in have mostly been tweed ones. And actually, I know I had one that was, I know this is a tweed one as well. And I don't buy them. People will typically send a kit amp to me when they get over their head, and I've got to undo mistakes and make it work. It's a good thing that people are willing to say, okay, I thought I could do this. I can't. I'm going to have this guy make it right, because it saves them money in the long run. They get a much better amp. But, if what I do is that easy, everyone would do it, as opposed to everyone thinking they know how to do it. Would the bridge pickup from a 63 Duosonic be a good choice for the middle pickup of a Nashville Telecaster? I don't see why not. It may or may not be the sound you love, but it would be a choice, and it might be the perfect choice. It might be a great choice for you and terrible for all your friends, or vice versa. It's so hard to recommend these things. I'm not 100% sure if the cutout for a Duosonic is the same as a Strat size single coil. So that'd be my concern. I wouldn't want you to have go to the expense of having a cutout made, and the Duosonic be too small or too large, or locking you into a Duosonic. But I can't imagine it would be terrible. It just may not be right for you, or it might be perfect. Let's see. Hey, To Do Tube, you want to connect it to pin 8. Sorry. Pin 8 is the correct one to connect to. Sorry, I had to think of it in my head. I had to go look at it in my head. All right, 8. You want to have the B plus connect taking off pin 8, not pin 2. That's a mistake that a lot of people make, including Vox in the TBX series, on a lot of them, not all of them. Hey, Gecko Jazz, the new Marshalls 20 watts. They're better. They make more sense in Europe than they do in America, where that you've got them for like 800, we've got them for like 1,800. But I don't think that they're worth $800. I think, given everything, I'd find a used Friedman and have something great. I just think they're $400 amps that are overcharging you by a factor of 2 and overcharging us by a factor of 4. They're just cheap. They're just really, really cheap. And the 20 watts especially, the way they bias those things, and how stingy they are with, I've had them come in, Origin 20s, with burnt resistors that were 2-watt resistors because there's 2.7 watts across them in normal operation. If any other company were to come on the market today, brand new company, selling these amps to people, they go out of business in 6 months, because everyone's like, this doesn't sound very good, and it's built like shit, and they want way too much money for it. But Marshall says Marshall. Let's see. Here's an interesting thing. John, if he's still here, says, Brad, I've sort of come to this conclusion in recent videos. The vintage obsession does nothing to help the modern amp industry particularly. Well, I think it can, John. I think the number one thing you need to realize is that people used to make more money than they do now. And so if you look at the Fender prices from 1964, 65, and you adjust for inflation, a deluxe reverb was about a $2,800 amp. A twin reverb was almost $4,000. And that's what people paid for them. And that was what they cost. To get something good, that's what it cost. And now we want to be able to get a deluxe reverb for $1,000 or get a twin reverb for $1,400. Well, because of offshore production, we suddenly can. But we expect the $1,400 twin to be as good as the $3,000 twin. We want the $1,000 deluxe reverb to be as good as the $3,000 deluxe reverb. Well, that's not going to happen. So people used to be willing to pay more for something, and people used to make more money than they do now. And that's beyond our control. But if you were to compare your 65 Pro Reverb to something Chris at Rift made for you, if you asked him to make you a 2x12 40-watt amp with a reverb, Pro Reverb, it's going to be a $3,500 or more amp. So, convert that to pounds, 3 to 4K in pounds, which is what a Pro Reverb would have cost in 1965. So, it actually will cost a little bit more, or Chris will make a little less profit on it because he's not set up to do it in production. Whether Leo and the guys, Don Randall and the guys had this line populating boards, this line making cabinets, and this line putting them all together so they can make them faster. So the cost per amp comes down. But if people are willing to spend, if people realize that, okay, I need to spend, we now consider like expensive stuff starting maybe at Dr. Z and going up to 2-Rock. Well, it used to be that you had Dr. Z stuff was like the baseline of what you could actually gig with. Anything below that was a student model or a toy, like a Silvertone. But I think people's expectations have become warped. This T-shirt is nowhere near as good as the T-shirts I was able to get 20 years ago for the same proportionate price. Everything is going down because everyone is looking for the cheapest of the cheap. So if someone gives a good amp designer the goal of bringing an amp to market that will cost the company $1,800 to make, they will come up with a great amp. But they're not. They're told to come up with an amp that will cost the company $400 to make, and they do that. And then people buy that $400 amp for $1,000, and it's a race to the bottom. Well, T777, there's no such thing as magical transformers and caps and all. There's good stuff and there's bad stuff. But there's a lot of flip side to what I was just saying about John and the market. There's so much mythology out there. It hurts. Jorge, options other than tack soldering when 6 or 7 wires don't fit in an eyelet. Thanks. Number one, you got to design so you're not getting trying to make more connections in an eyelet than the eyelet will support. Number two, there are different sizes of eyelets you can choose. It might be, if this is a repair situation, if there's room to put in a terminal strip to the chassis and that would buy you some extra terminals, you could bring all of those wires to that terminal and then a wire from that terminal to the eyelet. But I try very hard not to do tack soldering. That's one of the reasons you'll notice on all the Fender the Fenders that I do, the restorations of 60s Fenders, I'll take, just happen to have some here. Let's see if I can pick up two. I keep picking up the wrong ones. Sorry. sorry, I get this bit of tape off here. You might have noticed that I don't try to get the negative leads of both capacitors into the eyelet for a cathode. There, I will twist these together very neatly, and then snip off the excess of one, so I have one lead at the end going in to the eyelet of the cathode. And if strictly necessary, I could do the same thing with some resistors. If I had 2 half-watt carbon film resistors on the cathode there, well, those also have very narrow leads. I could do the same thing to the resistor if I needed to. So there are tricks you can do like that with actual components. But in general, you want to try to design things so you're not going to be trying to get more things in than fit. Hey, Detroit Wrecker, I use alphas all the time very happily in amplifiers. I just don't ground to the shell. I'll do a wired, I do a wired ground because alpha pots, the shells don't take solder well. There are guys out there who'll sand it and make it accept solder, but it's just much better on all ways for me to do a steered wired ground. But I love alpha pots. I think they sound fantastic. They're easy to clean. Unless you need to have a taper that Alpha doesn't sell, because they just do audio and linear. For some things, I'll use a J taper, in which case CTS is the only game in town. But I use Alphas all the time, even in very expensive amps where we could afford to use. I mean, we could do all PECs, and I've done that in the past and then had them get noisy, even though the whole promise of them is that they're sealed and will never get noisy. They do, but because they're sealed, once they're noisy, they're really hard to open. Alpha, I'll just spray it with some deoxit, and life goes on. Thank you. Hey, Rob Ravlin, thank you very much. You're up in the Northeast in New Hampshire. Maybe Brad has already answered this. I would have to look on the map. I've got a map of techs that I can recommend, but I'm not sure that I know someone in New Hampshire specifically. I think the people come to mind trail off about Springfield, Massachusetts, but I will try to look at that in a little bit, and I'll try to remember to put it in the comment of this video once the video is done. Brad's looking up. He's got access to the same database that I do. He's going to make a recommendation for you, Rob. And Brad's going to know what I know. Yeah, it's kind of crazy that, like 777 here says early 70s Princeton reverbs condition 4K and up. Just insane. That's the market for us these days. Let's see. I think I'm going to make a big pile of goop and hide an amp inside it. Yeah, I'm not a fan of goop. Let's see. I've not made too many newer orange amp videos. I've had a few, but don't get a lot of them. And a lot of the solid state ones, by the time that they fail, they're upside down in value, and and they tend to last a long time. I'm not a huge fan of the solid state oranges and solid state amps in general, but they tend to last. The solid state oranges specifically. Let's see. Thank you, Alex2112. Appreciate that. Yeah, SIRs are great. Their amps and the pedals and the guitars. Let's see. The frying pan, that's right. So we're caught up to that. Let's see. I don't have any experience with the Carvin X60. I'm sorry, Matthew Arnold. In the Carvins I have had in, I would not try to modify them. They're just not worth it. Sorry, I'm trying to read like 3 screens at once. KJS Destin, my Runt 50 has some internal modulation distortion. Just noticed, is it possible just a tube issue? Thank you very much. It is possible. I think you should contact Dave Friedman, because he stands behind his work, and he will be able to tell you, because he might say, "Oh, what serial number is yours?" Okay, yeah, we ran into that. I'll send you out this $3 capacitor and have C42 changed, whatever. But he can step you through it. It's without knowing more about that. Intermodulation distortion, I'm wondering if it might be one of the ARS, what Brad just says with those ARS caps. He did a series of runts that had an ARS filter cap, which had rubber plugs at each end. Most electrolytic caps have a rubber plug at one end and the solid metal at the other, but this series of ARS had rubber plugs at both ends. Those are the ones that were failing, and he was having those replaced as warranty repairs. I can't speak for him, but he was having that taken care of. And they're really good amps. And when you're making these things, you have to use what's on the market. And if you get a bad batch, you don't have any control of that. It may be 3 years before you realize it was a bad batch. So yeah, 2 bungs, as Brad says. Hey, Whitlock. Any tips on a Mojetone Princeton kit? Triple check your work. Sometimes it's good to either draw it yourself or write out the instructions yourself, because just that simple act of writing what you've just read puts it in your memory better. And just take pictures as you go and be very careful. Any spare parts you should also order. I don't know, because I don't know what all comes in the kit and whether you have enough slack, extra wire or whatever. Just take your time and enjoy it. All right, we got 10 more minutes, and I don't know if I'm going to be able. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to be missing some questions, and I apologize to anyone whose questions I miss. I see some super chats that I feel I am obligated to answer before we wind things up, and then I'll take some questions at the end. Right now, people are talking about kookaburras, and there's nothing wrong with that, unless you are an old gum tree. Let's see. Yeah. One day, actually some days I have gotten caught up, but this is not going to be one of those days. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. Thank you, Ike. Thank you, Christopher Westland. Very kind of you. Sorry if I'm having trouble with the name. I've got this light right here so you can see me and all that, but I forgot to do this. I forgot to tilt my screen. There we go. That's why. I had a glare. I was like, all right, much better when I remember to tilt the screen. Let me do it a little less so it's not appearing on your screen. There he goes. All right. That's the magic angle. Let's see. All right. So I'm going to start replying from the, let's see, questions. 63 AC30 sell or keep it KS. Well, it's one of the all-time great amps. I don't know what level of work that particular 63 may need. 63 AC30s can be absolute money pits, or they can be the best amp you've ever played in your life. I don't know what your budget is. I don't know if it suits your needs, because it can. What's one person's perfect amp is someone else's. It's all right. It's kind of heavy, kind of smells hot sometimes. I don't know what condition is. I would keep it, but I'm particularly a voxophile. I cannot advise you what to do or what not to do. Jacob K. Guitar, just take your time, and you will not lose anything that you liked about the Marshall. You'll just not have to have as much hum and buzz and noise, even noise that you never realized was there before. I think if you take your time and you work through it the way I show, you'll be very, very happy. Hey, Eric Blaha. I think I answered this exactly earlier. No, I'm sorry. There was 2 different questions. One was about a 64 custom Princeton, and one was about the volume. The volume changing abruptly between 2 and 3, that's the CTS 1 meg audio taper pot that they use. If you want to have a tech change it out to a J taper or an alpha 1 meg pot, that won't happen anymore. But the CTS 10% taper, audio taper, log taper, 1 meg pot, that's what that does. And that's not really Fender's fault. That's a CTS thing. You can't avoid it unless you change the pot. Sorry. I have not met Brad in person yet because he is a long way away, but he might be coming to America at some point, in which case he is absolutely welcome here. I would go to Australia, except it is so goddamn far. And I, with all respect to Australia, aside from the different wildlife and some scenery, culturally it's not radically different from America. So I don't know, other than having a good friend there, which is wonderful, I don't know that I feel like I'm learning as much in Australia as I do when I travel to cultures that are different. Even England is seemingly, in my experience, more different from America than Australia is. And that's, in one sense, I mean that as a compliment to Australia, but I might learn some new cuss words, though. That'd be fun. But I can do that online. Hey, Jesse's Guitars, you can. But if you jump the channels on a Tremolux, they're going to be out of phase. And you probably have some ground noise introduced if you do that. All Fenders that have reverb and tremolo put the tremolo after the reverb. You can just get a. You just don't use the tremolo, or use a tremolo pedal in front of the amp. That'd probably be the better way to do it. But it seems odd to me. I think the Tremolux sounds really nice, but I'm weird that way. If you really, okay, the Tremolux, sorry, I'm tired. Tremolux, is that just tremolo without reverb? I didn't realize how tired I was. I could not get to sleep last night for anything. My arms were hurting so bad. The reverb tremolo after reverb is always worked for everyone else. So I don't know what to tell you on that. Hey, Buddy Parker, on the deluxe reverb reissues, mostly I've covered this in other videos on the channel. Make sure all the hardware is tight, and I show how to do that. I think it's called like simple things any owner can do, Fender owner can do, or whatever. It's in my Fender reissue playlist. I've got playlists, and one of them is called Fender reissues or Fender reissue amps. It's somewhere in there showing what owners can do, and a lot of it is just tightening hardware. If I was starting over repairing amps in 2025, where would I begin? I wouldn't, because I don't think that there'll be amps to repair 15 years from now. I would figure out how to make money servicing Cisco routers, or get a real estate license or something. Actually, I'd probably go become a general contractor, because it's similar problem solving, but those problems will continue to exist. I think amplifiers are going to be tube amplifiers, analog discrete amplifiers are going to become like watches, in that they will be kind of luxury items and retro, spitting in the face of the future choices. Most people are going to be using digital. Most people are going to be using little, somehow it'll just be like having it built into your phone. You just buy the musician pack for your phone and have all these things. We're a long way from getting there, but that writing is on the wall. So, I mean, people will happily pay $12,000 for a Rolex watch that has less accurate time than what they already have on their cell phone. But they'll buy the $12,000 Rolex because of the status. And I think 20 years from now, that'll be the case with having a deluxe reverb, because my God, getting the tubes 20 years from now will be a very expensive proposition, unless something radically changes, which is very unlikely. It's possible that someone will come up with a little plug-in thing that does what a tube does. It fits in existing amps and costs $20, but it has not happened yet. So I don't know that this is something that people need to start doing. But as I tell people, if you really want to learn how to do this, start with valvewizard.co.uk, Merlin Blenko's books. They're a great place to start. But I think it's be a bad career choice in 2025. Ryan Benetham, I'm sorry to tell you this. There's nothing to do to get the most out of the AC4 hand wired. You can if you want. You can spend a lot of money upgrading it. It's never going to be a very good amp. It's never going to be a versatile amp. And I'm not trying to shit on you. There are a lot of 4-watt amps that aren't very good. About the only ones that I would consider good would be a pre-72 Vibrochamp or the stuff that Swart makes. But in general, the AC4 has always been kind of oh yeah, we make that too kind of thing. And I don't see the point of it. It's not that a low wattage amp has to be bad. It's just that one is. And the hand wired is a more expensive version of a not very good amp. I would really recommend that right now, most people have not seen my channel and they have no idea that it's not a very good amplifier. So I would say sell it to someone who wants an AC4 and buy something that's going to be more versatile. I think if you want a good, inexpensive tube amp, the two starting points for most players who are looking for classic sounds would be either a Princeton reissue, used, would be under $1,000, or the AC15 C1. As I've said a lot, because with the master volume on that, you can turn it down to the same level as the AC4, but have a much better sound with a much better sounding speaker. I think we're about time to wrap this up. We've at 3 hours, and I've got stuff I've got to take care of today. I'm sure you all do as well. Thank you for being with me, and I'm sorry for the questions that I've missed. The M5000 just saw your question. In a 67 Deluxe Princeton Reverb, you can use a 5AR4, a 5U4GB, and I think a 5R4 is fine, but I'd have to look that up, and I don't have time right now. I appreciate everyone being here. And take care, and I'll try to get some amp videos up this week. Thank you, Bennett Amplification. And I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop. Thanks.